The wind howled across the barren expanse of ice and snow, threading its way through broken pines and ancient evergreens. A hush fell over the world beyond the wall, as if the land itself held its breath, awaiting something yet unwritten in the annals of time. Jon Snow exhaled and saw the ghostly swirl of his own breath vanish into the cold. He had come north once more, banished by a compromise that spared bloodshed in King's Landing, but it had never truly felt like an exile. Since the night he and the free folk journeyed beyond the edge of the Seven Kingdoms, he had seen things that once felt impossible. He had tasted freedom in the emptiness of the tundra, in the calls of 1,000 ravens echoing across the midnight sky. And yet, inside his chest, a small and persistent restlessness continued to tighten its grip, a reminder that he did not fully belong among the free folk, just as he had never belonged at Winterfell or even the Night's Watch in all the ways one might wish. There was something unfinished, waiting for him to confront it. He strode across the uneven ground, Ghost padding silently at his side. The direwolf's presence was a comfort. Others might claim direwolves had no place beyond the wall. He was an odd sight among the ragged foxes and giant white bears that roamed the frosty plains, but Jon had never questioned it. Ghost was his truth, his tether, the one constant presence he had left from his boyhood in Winterfell, back when he was still a snow and not yet aware of the blood that truly ran through his veins. That blood, Targaryen blood, had cost him dearly, for it had brought him into conflict with the destiny of kings, queens, and dragons. In dreams, he still remembered Daenerys, remembered the storm of her eyes when she had believed in a new world, the break in her voice when she'd spoken of mercy while forging a path of fire and blood. He remembered how she had soared upon the back of Drogon. The jarring memory of that final confrontation in the Red Keep remained etched into his soul, forcing him to relive the sense of horror and inevitability each time he closed his eyes. They had both been used and undone by prophecy, heartbreak, and illusions of destiny. Maybe in another life, they could have ruled together, tempered each other's faults, found a way to unite the kingdoms. But it had all crumbled. His memory of her final breath and the warm trickle of blood on his hands was a private torment he bore in silence. No one in the north pressed him to speak of such things. The free folk cared little for the politics of the south, or for the wars of kings and queens that always seemed so distant. Tormund Giantsbane, who had once drunk sour goat's milk beside a campfire and called Jon a true friend, never once asked him about Daenerys or the Iron Throne that had allegedly melted into a pool of molten slag. He had let the matter rest, trusting Jon to talk about it when or if he ever chose. But despite the stillness of this new life, Jon was haunted by the question that had always shaped him. Who am I? Truly? Walking onward, he paused by a meager stream that still trickled despite the falling snow. In the sky, the aurora shimmered faintly, twisting into shapes of green and purple against the endless black. He reached for his waterskin to fill it, only to stop when Ghost let out a soft growl. A shape emerged from between two shadowy ridges. Jon tensed, though not in alarm. He recognized the figure's stride even through the gloom. Long limbs, a quick gait, bundled in furs that had been stitched and patched so many times they were almost more patchwork than hide. "Good evening, Jon," said Val, her breath puffing before her in a swirl of white mist. Her voice was low, carrying just far enough to touch his ears and no further. He inclined his head, heart beating a fraction faster. He had developed a strange warmth for Val in recent moons, a companionable respect that might someday grow into something deeper, though he was still uncertain. The wildling princess, sister to Dalla, who had borne Mance Rayder's child, was as fierce as she was unbound. She fit the land here, a secret carved out of ice and survival, and she had proven herself time and again an ally. They had once traveled together to parley with tribes hidden deep in the wastes, forging tenuous alliances in the wake of the White Walker threat. "I wondered when you'd come find me," he said, kneeling to scoop a handful of frigid water and splash it across his mouth. "Been out here for a while." She nodded. "Tormund wants to talk to you. He's heard rumors coming up from the south. A few men arrived 2 nights ago at the new settlement near Hardhome. They're from King's Landing." Jon's gaze flickered. He rose, letting the water drip from his fingers into the snow. "From King's Landing, you say?" "Aye," said Val. "Outsiders, but they speak of crows on the wing, of new tidings from across the narrow sea. And you." The last word hung in the air. Ghost whined softly. John's heart gave a traitorous lurch. He had never asked for news from the south, but it always seemed to come. Why should he be surprised? He was the last living Targaryen, a secret once carefully guarded, but now likely spread by tongues across the world. He might have desired oblivion in this cold desert, but it was not to be. Where Targaryens trod, fables of dragons, doom, and kingdoms reborn followed like shadows. Without another word, he slung his cloak over his shoulders and began heading back towards the encampment. Val fell into step beside him, silent but watchful. Overhead, the aurora flickered out, as if the sky itself had blinked and changed its mind. The night deepened, stars burning cold and bright. Jon tried to steel himself for whatever the men from King's Landing might say. The realm had always been unsettled, prone to rumor, but talk of the Targaryen line was a flame in a tinder-dry forest, an ember that could ignite chaos. They traveled for hours beneath the harsh winter moon. Each footstep crunched loudly in the crust of snow, the sound echoing off distant rock formations. Occasionally, they heard the hoot of an owl or the faint calls of strange beasts that roamed farther north. Ghost prowled ahead, ears pricked, guiding them. At last, they caught sight of the settlement's crude wooden palisade. Once, Hardhome had been a place of tragedy, a site of slaughter and necromancy under the White Walker's gaze. Now it had become a fledgling community for the free folk, brought together by the hardships they had shared. A line of torches lit the entrance, and a pair of wildling sentries nodded to Jon as he and Val passed. Women and children of the free folk were huddled around small fires or within hastily constructed huts. The swirl of firelight and flurries made the scene seem half-real. Jon found Tormund in the largest structure at the settlement center, a communal hall built from salvaged timbers and stone. The big man was sitting at a long table, sharing a horn of ale with two men clad in furs too new and well-tailored for the far north, likely the arrivals from King's Landing. Tormund saw Jon before the visitors did and jumped to his feet, thumping his chest in greeting. "Jon Snow, I told these fancy boys I'd have you here in no time." The two visitors rose, uncertain, eyes flicking between Jon's face and Ghost slinking in at his side. Both men were young, bearded, and wore the air of courtiers trying and failing to disguise their origins. Their clothes, though rugged and stitched, seemed cut from finer materials than the average blacksmith scraps. If they had intended to pass themselves off as wanderers, they had not succeeded. Jon stepped closer, ignoring the question in their eyes and the tension in their posture. "You've come a long way," Jon said quietly. One of the men nodded, swallowing as if forcing down nerves. "We have, my lord." "Not a lord," Jon reminded him, though the denial rang hollow. Perhaps once he had been a brother of the Night's Watch, but that was done. Perhaps he had briefly been named king in the north, also done. He had tried to disclaim every title forced upon him, yet the Targaryen in his blood remained. He could never disclaim that, no matter how fervently he might wish it. "We were sent by," the man hesitated, glancing at Tormund, then at Val and then at Jon once more. "By Tyrion Lannister, the king's hand." Tormund let out a noisy snort. "The little man with the clever tongue. Good drinker, that one. What does he want with Jon Snow?" Jon stared into the man's eyes, remembering Tyrion Lannister's face. They had shared a strange kinship once, an understanding of bastards, cripples, and broken things. He should have guessed that if anyone sought him out, it would be Tyrion. "Speak. We're all friends here." The envoy bowed his head a fraction. "Very well. His Grace, Bran the Broken, continues to rule from the Red Keep. The realm is healing slowly from the wars and the destruction. But there are matters that trouble the crown. Rumors have spread from Essos of new movements stirring in the free cities, of men and women claiming the legacy of old Valyria and the dragons. The Hand requests your presence, or at least your counsel, as the last living Targaryen. He believes the threat might be real. Jon's face twitched. Threat? The second visitor nodded, stepping forward. Aye, my Jon Snow. There is talk of dragon eggs being discovered far east, across the Valyrian peninsula, in places once deemed too cursed to tread. Even talk of warlocks or priests who claim they can wake the old blood of Valyria. The king's hand fears that if these rumors hold any truth, the Seven Kingdoms could again face the terror of dragons wielded by those who care nothing for Westeros. He thinks you, with your blood, could be vital to forging a new alliance or preventing war. Jon felt a stirring in his chest, a disquiet that reminded him of the day he learned of his parentage. The idea of a Targaryen claim unsettled him greatly. He had no wish to become a king or to raise armies. But if a new power was rising in Essos, and if they could indeed hatch dragons, then the world could be faced with a fresh scouring fire. Had not the last dragon war ended in ashes enough? He glanced at Tormund, who gave a half-shrug. If the little man wants you, he must be desperate. You're done with them, though, aren't you? Jon did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked to the envoys again. So, Tyrion wants me to come back to King's Landing. They exchanged glances, uncertain. He asks your aid, said the first man. He knows your loyalty may not belong to him or even to the crown now, after all that's happened. But there is no one else alive who carries the blood of the dragon as purely as you do. Your father, Rhaegar Targaryen. Jon cut him off with a sharp look, and the man swallowed the rest of his words. Val reached out, her hand briefly brushing Jon's shoulder. In that single moment, he remembered that he was not alone. He had friendships, allegiances, even a kind of family here, but he also bore a debt. He had played his part in ending the threat of the Night King, yes, but in doing so, he had discovered the weight of his parentage too late to spare thousands from death. He inhaled, letting the tension pool in his lungs before releasing it in a trembling exhale. When did you last see Tyrion? 2 moons ago, said the second envoy. We traveled by ship up the east coast of Westeros, then overland to Castle Black, but we heard you'd gone farther north. Your friend here. He inclined his head at Tormund. He agreed to meet us and bring us to you. Tormund nodded. Gotta keep track of you, Crow. You vanish too easily in the snows. A flicker of amusement tugged at Jon's lips. But the gravity of the situation weighed on him. Dragon eggs in Essos, claims of a new Valyria, these were not trifles. If such a movement existed, it could threaten the precarious peace in Westeros. And Tyrion would not have sent men so far unless he believed it was something beyond the ordinary tapestry of rumor. Jon turned to Tormund. I need time to think. Will you give them shelter for the night? Tormund spat onto the ground. Sure, though I prefer a good fight to all this talk of skulking dragons. But they'll be fed and protected here. Val regarded Jon with a careful expression. You have that look again, Jon Snow. He lifted a brow. What look is that? That look that says you're going to do something foolish and brave, and possibly get yourself killed. She paused. I've seen it before. Jon almost smiled. Maybe I will. Or maybe I'll just refuse them and spend the rest of my days hunting elk with Tormund. I've had my fill of wars. But the war never seems done with you, she said softly. He couldn't argue with that. With a curt nod to the envoys and a brief clap on Tormund's shoulder, Jon headed back into the night, Ghost trailing behind. Val followed at a distance, giving him room to breathe but refusing to let him vanish alone into the darkness. He paced through the edge of Hardhome, through narrow walkways between huts and tents, searching for the clarity that eluded him. All he found was the quiet hush of despair. People here lived day to day, forging a new beginning in the aftermath of unimaginable horrors. If a new threat arose across the sea, it could one day claim them as well. Hiding here in the far north might offer temporary solace, but not true peace. He remembered, then, the times he'd spoken with Daenerys about the dreams she had of building a better world, free from tyranny. It burned to recall the hope in her voice. Could it be that the seeds of Valyria had not truly died with her, or even with her ancestors when the doom struck? Was there something about that ancient bloodline that would not rest until it carved its mark upon the earth again? Sighing, Jon brushed his fingers through Ghost's thick fur. "What do we do, boy?" Ghost merely pressed his head into Jon's side, offering silent comfort. Snow began to fall more heavily, swirling into drifts that gathered around the ragged corners of the settlement. Val approached again, stopping just behind him. "You know you can't ignore this," she said. "If the Targaryen blood means so much to those across the sea, it might mean something to your people in the south as well." Jon nodded slowly. He thought of Sansa, Arya, Bran, all scattered, forging their own paths. Bran was king in the south, though in truth, Jon had not yet grown used to that notion. Arya had sailed off to unknown lands. Sansa ruled in Winterfell, her hair kissed by the northern sun, her will unbreakable. She likely heard rumors, too. Perhaps she had learned more than this meager scrap of rumor from Essos. Val placed a hand on his arm. "I once told you I have no love for your southern ways. But if it's a matter of life and death, or a threat that spans oceans, you cannot simply stand aside. You're the closest thing they have to an answer." He took her hand in his, feeling the slight tremor in her fingers, though it could have been the cold. "I'm tired of war," he said more gently. "Tired of being used, of seeing friends die." "So am I," Val admitted. "But what choice do we have when the storm comes for us? We can either meet it or try to hide under the ice. And that is never a sure thing." Jon pressed his lips together. He was reminded oddly of Mance Rayder and his defiance in the face of the White Walkers. The king beyond the wall had fought for the survival of his people, even against impossible odds. He had refused to bow. Could Jon do anything less if another storm rose in the east? He murmured, "I should speak to Tormund again, find out exactly what these envoys told him. Then, maybe I'll decide." Val gave him a half-smile. "You've already decided, Jon Snow." And maybe she was right. Morning came in silver and white, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened more snow. Jon rose from his pallet on the wooden floor of a half-built lodge, prying his stiff body upright. His old wounds ached in the chill. Ghost was curled by the doorway. Jon left quietly, not wanting to disturb the families still sleeping in the adjoining area. He made his way back to the communal hall, where Tormund was already awake, breaking his fast with a chunk of dried meat and a skin of ale. Tormund's ruddy face brightened at the sight of him. "Jon Snow, you sleep like a corpse these days." Jon shrugged, leaning against a post. "I or worse." "Ha! That's the spirit." Tormund ripped off another bite of meat. "So, what did that pretty head of yours decide?" Jon gave him a level look. "I need to hear everything those men said. I need to know what's happening in Essos." Tormund nodded, then gestured for Jon to sit. Together, they called the two envoys over. The men seemed more at ease in daylight, though their eyes still flicked about warily at the wildlings who passed through the hall for warmth. Without ceremony, Tormund demanded they recount every detail of what Tyrion had told them before they left King's Landing. The men, named Rickard and Bennis, took turns weaving the story of whispered rumors from across the narrow sea. "A merchant from Pentos arrived in King's Landing some months ago," Rickard began, claiming he had done business with a group of sorcerers or blood mages, men who worshipped the memory of Valyria. He said they called themselves the Scions of the Flame. "Sounds like a bunch of fools," Tormund muttered. Bennis shook his head. "Fools or not, they have coin and influence. This merchant said they paid handsomely for certain relics. Dragonbone, rubies, old scrolls in High Valyrian. They also displayed what appeared to be petrified eggs. Not ancient ones either, but newly discovered. He said they were warm to the touch, as if something stirred within." Jon's jaw tightened. Dragon eggs were not fables. He recalled Daenerys hatching 3 from petrified shells in the Dothraki Sea. It had changed the world, set her on a path of conquest. If someone else had discovered more eggs and learned how to hatch them, the entire realm might be thrown into upheaval again. Rickard continued, "The merchant has since vanished. Some say he returned to Pentos, Others believe the crown imprisoned him for fear he spread panic. But the Hand, Lord Tyrion, thinks the merchant was telling the truth, or at least believed what he was saying. Lord Tyrion fears that if these Scions of the Flame truly succeed in hatching dragons, they might attempt to rebuild a Valyrian empire in Essos. They could wage war on the free cities, or even cross the sea to Westeros. Jon drummed his fingertips on the table. Ghost, lying at his feet, growled as if sharing in his unease. How many are they? We don't know. They apparently travel in small groups, recruiting mages and sellswords with a promise of glory. But there are rumors that one of the free cities, Myr perhaps, has seen an influx of these so-called Scions. The locals whisper of their gatherings by night, chanting in the old tongues, promising the return of the Dragon Lords. Tormund scoffed loudly. Dragon Lords? I fought wights, giants, and lords of bones. All the same, they all bleed if you cut them deep enough. Jon, however, stared at the table's worn surface, remembering a line from the old text Sam once read to him. Fire consumes, but Valyrian steel endures. There was an uncanny resilience to that ancient civilization, a lurking presence in the shape of blackened ruins and half-whispered spells. The doom had shattered Valyria centuries ago, but the echoes of that day still resonated in the smoking sea. Was it so impossible to think that, given enough time and cunning, someone might attempt to reclaim the lost arts? We should take this seriously, Jon said at last. If Tyrion is asking for my help, it's because he believes there's a chance the threat is real. But what exactly does he want me to do? Bennis offered a slight shrug. Speak to the king. Share your knowledge. The Hand believes that your presence will lend credibility to negotiations with any Targaryen loyalists who might be drawn to such a cause. Or, failing that, perhaps your presence would dissuade them. After all, you are the rightful heir, son of Rhaegar, last in the line. Don't, Jon said sharply. I renounced any claim. I am no king. Val, who had entered the hall in silence, spoke up behind him. What does it matter if you call yourself king or not? The truth is in your blood, Jon Snow. He closed his eyes momentarily. The truth was a burden he wished he'd never discovered, but ignoring it would not spare him or the realm from its consequences. Fine, tell Tyrion. Tell him I'll return to Winterfell for a time. I'll speak with my sister, the Lady of Winterfell, and see what she advises. If the crown needs my counsel, they can send word to Winterfell. Rickard and Bennis exchanged relieved looks. Yes, of course. We can ride south with you, if that is your wish. Jon shook his head. No, I'll find my own way. You can return to Castle Black first and send a raven to the king's hand. Let him know I'm coming, but on my own terms. Tormund snorted. I suppose you'll be wanting to drag me along? Or will you leave me to babysit these southern fools? Jon gave a wry smile. I need you to look after our people here. They're still rebuilding. He sensed Tormund's reluctance. The big man had stood beside Jon through many trials, from Hardhome to the Battle of the Bastards. But Tormund also belonged here, among his own folk, forging a new future. It would be selfish to tear him away. All right, said Tormund gruffly. But if you end up needing me to bash some heads, you send word. I'll come riding a bear to find you if I have to. Jon was grateful for the hint of humor. He clapped Tormund on the shoulder. I'll keep that in mind. Val's voice cut through the lull. I'm going with you. Jon pivoted, searching her face. Val, you need someone who's been among the free folk all her life, who knows how to handle the unknown, she insisted. You might be a man of two worlds, but there's more than that out there, especially if we're dealing with magic and old stories come alive. Besides, I won't let you wander south on your own. I've grown fond of your constant brooding. Tormund let out a booming laugh. She keeps you on your toes, Crow. Best take her. Jon looked at Val. In her eyes, he saw a clear determination, possibly even curiosity about the southern lands she'd never truly explored. Part of him wanted to shield her from the intrigues of courts and crowns, but to do so would deny who she was. A free spirit who walked where she pleased. Maybe he needed her more than he realized. A certain steadiness warmed his chest at the idea. "Very well," he said. "Pack what you need. We'll leave at first light tomorrow." She nodded, a hint of a smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. Jon spent the rest of that day preparing for the journey. He scavenged warmer pelts for Val, gathered provisions of dried meats and fruits, even coaxed some mead from Tormund's personal stash in case they found themselves too far from any inns. Meanwhile, Rickard and Bennis made ready to ride for Castle Black, delivering Jon's message. The thought of crossing once more into the realm of the living, the civilized South, filled Jon with a quiet apprehension. The last time he had been in King's Landing, he had ended a chapter of his life in fire and blood. He had parted ways with those he once called friends, left the seat of power behind him. Now, he was returning to face old ghosts, though he told himself he would only go as far as Winterfell. The pull of family was strong, but the pang of guilt for past deeds was stronger. Night fell, and Jon stood outside Hardhome's gate, watching the cold stars appear one by one, like the eyes of silent watchers overhead. Ghost was a faintly visible shape beside him, ears alert, scanning the darkness. Presence stepped closer, Val. She came to stand next to him, her breath mingling with his in the frosty air. "You're thinking of leaving in the middle of the night," she observed softly. "Did you change your mind about waiting till morning?" Jon glanced at her. "No, I gave Tormund my word, but I was tempted." She nodded, her pale hair catching a glimmer of moonlight. "You're afraid." He considered denying it, but decided against the lie. "Yes, I'm afraid. I've lost so much in the South. I could lose more. There's a part of me that wonders if I shouldn't just vanish into these northern lands forever. Let them handle their own troubles." Val was quiet for a moment. "But you won't, because that's not who you are." His chuckle emerged as a bitter puff of air. "So I've been told." She placed her hand gently on his. "I saw you fight for us once, against the White Walkers, against the Night's Watch itself, in a way because you believed that all our lives mattered. You've bled for every corner of the realm. You won't stop just because you've had enough. The realm hasn't had enough of you." He turned his gaze to her, taking in the firm line of her jaw, the unwavering steadiness in her eyes. For all her seeming fragility, Val was as unyielding as the hardest ice. She had the heart of the free North and the quiet resilience that accompanied it. He found himself drawing comfort from her presence. "Come," he said, giving her hand a squeeze. "Let's get some sleep. Tomorrow's a long road." They set out the next day, saddling 2 sturdy Garrans, small northern horses that could endure the cold, borrowed from the free folk. Jon rode with Ghost running close, while Val's hooded cloak billowed behind her in the wind. The path stretched southward, first across broken ice fields, then through jagged passes in the hills, until at last they would glimpse the old towers of Castle Black. The journey was harsh but not unfamiliar. The nights were frigid, sometimes forcing them to huddle together for warmth under a single cloak beside meager campfires. Val occasionally teased Jon about the differences between wildling life and his old oath-bound existence, but her laughter had no malice, only curiosity. He caught himself smiling more than once. They arrived at Castle Black after 2 weeks of travel, battered by storms and half-blinded by whiteouts. The old fortress looked different, with fewer black-cloaked brothers patrolling the walls. The realm no longer needed a vast night's watch. The threat beyond the wall had ended, or so everyone believed. A scattering of dedicated souls still manned the battlements, out of tradition or duty. They recognized Jon immediately and greeted him with a respect tinged with astonishment. Here was Lord Commander Snow, or the man once known as such, returning with a beautiful wildling woman at his side and a ghostly direwolf at his heels. Jon paused beneath the raised portcullis. The courtyard was eerily silent compared to his memories. Several new recruits, likely criminals or orphans in search of structure, hovered near the armory, exchanging uncertain glances. Val dismounted, eyes sweeping over the fortress with a pensive air. An aging steward approached, bowing awkwardly. "We've had word of your coming, my lord, or, well, Jon Snow." He glanced at Val. "We have quarters prepared if you need rest." "We won't stay long," Jon replied, remembering too many ghosts in these halls. He thanked the steward nonetheless and asked after the envoys, Rickard and Bennis. They had left for Winterfell not long ago, sending ravens ahead. Sansa Stark would by now know that Jon was on his way. That evening, Jon sat in the once familiar mess hall, a simple place with long wooden tables and a smoky hearth. The stew was bland, the ale watered down, but it awakened memories of the nights he had once spent here as a young recruit under Ser Aliser's harsh gaze, or while joking with Gren and PYP. The pang of loss returned, but he pushed it aside. Val sipped her stew, her gaze drifting across the row of Night's Watchmen also eating. Some offered stiff nods. Others tried to sneak curious glances at her, as if they couldn't fathom a wildling woman in their midst, especially one so self-possessed. She smiled to herself, holding their stares until they hastily looked away. "They're afraid of me," she noted once they were alone again. Jon swallowed a mouthful of stew. "They don't know what to make of you. The Watch used to fight your people, kill them if they tried crossing the wall." She shrugged. "And now they've realized we're not the enemies they once feared. Maybe that's progress." Jon gave a short, ironic laugh. "Yes, maybe it is." That night, as the wind howled around the towers of Castle Black, Jon dreamed of dragons. He saw visions of swirling flame, of black wings casting immense shadows over armies. He stood amidst ash and ruin, trying to shield a faceless crowd from the blazing heat. Then he was falling, plunging into the smoking sea, swallowed by fire and water, helpless. When he awoke, cold sweat clung to his back, and he found Ghost lying nearby, growling softly in the darkness. Val stirred beside him, a line of concern creasing her brow. "Another dream?" she asked quietly. Jon nodded, trying to slow his ragged breathing. "I keep seeing dragons and destruction." She placed a hand gently on his arm. He closed his eyes, willing the images to fade. But even as the night receded, the sense of foreboding lingered. 2 more weeks passed as Jon and Val traveled south from Castle Black to Winterfell. The snows gradually thinned, revealing the old roads that branched like veins across the north. They passed scattered villages, many still recovering from the ravages of war. Some recognized Jon as the king in the north from days gone by. Others saw only 2 weary travelers on horses, accompanied by a giant white wolf. Winterfell emerged over the horizon one bleak afternoon, the tips of its towers rising above a rolling plain. Jon felt his heart lurch at the sight. Memories flooded him. Sitting in the courtyard with Robb, practicing swordplay. Sneaking off with Arya to chase cats. Washing horses with Rickon, who was too young to care about chores properly. And, of course, the presence of Ned Stark, standing tall, silent, an unwavering presence in Jon's life. How small he had felt then, a bastard among true-born children. Now he carried the blood of Targaryen kings, and Ned Stark was gone, along with much of the family he'd known. Val slowed her horse beside him. "That's it then? The seat of your sister, your family." He nodded, swallowing a lump in his throat. "Yes, home." The gate guards recognized him instantly, even bundled as he was in pelts. They cried for the portcullis to be raised. Jon and Val rode into the courtyard, where stable hands rushed forward to take their horses. Ghost's presence caused a stir, but the men parted, remembering the rumors of Jon Snow's direwolf. He dismounted and was immediately greeted by a swirl of cloaks. A tall, red-haired figure emerged, face etched with poised authority. Sansa Stark, Lady of Winterfell. She wore a heavy gown of gray wool lined with fur, a silver direwolf pin at her collar. There was no hesitation in her steps as she strode forward and embraced Jon. The warmth of her gesture was a sharp contrast to the memory of how they had parted. Her sending him away to the wall, fulfilling the demands of the realm. But here, in Winterfell, she allowed herself to be a sister first, a ruler second. "Jon," she whispered against his ear, her arms tight around him. "You came." He squeezed her in return, surprised by how relieved he felt. "Sansa, I..." She pulled back, studying him. Her clear eyes glistened. "I'm so sorry for," she began, but he shook his head. "No, there's nothing to apologize for. You did what you had to, for the peace of the realm." She nodded slowly, then turned her gaze to Val, arching an elegant brow. "And who is this?" Val lifted her chin. "I am Val." Jon cleared his throat. "She's a friend, and an ally from beyond the wall. She came with me to offer help." Sansa looked thoughtful. "We owe the free folk much, especially after the long night. You're both welcome here. Please come inside, warm yourselves. We have much to discuss." They followed her into the great hall, where the warmth of roaring hearths chased away the chill. Servants brought mulled wine and bread. Val examined her surroundings with interest, noting the banners of House Stark that hung from the rafters. Gray direwolves on a field of white. Jon felt a swirl of nostalgia. So much had changed since he was a boy, but in some ways, Winterfell felt as timeless as the gods would at its heart. Sansa led them to a smaller solar off the main hall, a more private setting for urgent matters. There, she dismissed the servants and sat at a large wooden table, gesturing for Jon and Val to do the same. Ghost settled near the door, head on his paws. Sansa's expression grew grave. "Tyrion Lannister sent word weeks ago that men were seeking you in the north. I suppose you've heard what's happening in Essos?" Jon nodded. "I heard. Rumors of dragon eggs and a group calling themselves the Scions of the Flame. Tyrion wants me to help. I plan to do what I can." Sansa studied him. "But what can you do, truly, if these people have found a way to hatch new dragons? Will you try to claim them as a Targaryen? Can you?" Jon forced himself not to wince at the mention of his lineage. Sansa was one of the few people who knew the truth. "I have no intention of claiming them," he said. "That path leads to more violence. But if this group truly aims to restore the Valyrian Empire, they could threaten the peace of the realm. I won't let that happen." Val listened quietly, taking in the interplay. Sansa folded her hands on the table. "Lord Tyrion wrote that the king shares his concerns, and that many lords in Westeros are uneasy about these rumors. They fear another Targaryen might rise, or that foreign dragon lords might come seeking conquest." Jon's lips pressed together in a thin line. "There has been enough conquest. If these Scions truly exist, perhaps I can talk them down, or at least learn their purpose." Sansa leaned forward. "And if they will not listen? If they intend to conquer Westeros?" Jon hesitated. Memories of Drogon laying waste to King's Landing flashed before him. "Then we do what must be done to protect our people." A hush settled over the chamber. Sansa let out a slow breath. "I had hoped never to see another war like the ones we've endured, but the world seems determined to test us." Val's voice interjected. "Where do we start? Surely we don't sail blindly into Essos." Sansa nodded. "You should speak with Tyrion in King's Landing. He has informants across the narrow sea, a network of spies gleaning what they can. Then, if necessary, you might travel to Essos under the crown's protection." Jon allowed the weight of it to settle on him. Once again, he'd be stepping into the fray. "I'll go, but I won't swear fealty or pledge any Targaryen claim. I come only to help." "Of course," Sansa replied. "But be careful, Jon. The lords of Westeros might not be so open-minded. They know you have Targaryen blood, and some still see that blood as a threat." Jon smiled wryly. "I've never sought a throne. They can keep their crowns." Sansa's gaze softened. "I believe you, but not everyone will." A thoughtful silence followed. After a time, Sansa invited them to rest. "Stay a few days," she insisted. "You've come a long way. Let me gather more news. Then we'll arrange safe passage south." Jon glanced at Val, who gave a small nod. "All right," he said. "We'll stay." "Thank you, Sansa." That evening, the castle dined together in the great hall. Sansa welcomed Jon openly, seating him at her side. Val drew many curious stares from Winterfell's bannermen, but she met their gazes evenly. Jon watched how she interacted, never shrinking, never boasting, simply being who she was. He felt a flicker of admiration. She reminded him of the best parts of Ygritte, but with her own, more introspective nature. As the night wore on, Jon retired to the quiet corridors he once roamed as a youth. The faint smell of smoke and pine wood carried him back in time. He found himself drifting toward the crypts. Taking a torch, he made his way down the winding steps into the cold darkness. Statues of Starks from generations past stood sentinel in their niches, stone eyes watching over their domain for eternity. He passed Ned Stark's statue, pausing before it. The face was carved in stern lines, the faithful likeness of the man who had raised him. "Father," Jon murmured, though he knew Ned Stark was, in truth, his uncle. Yet he would always be Jon's father in spirit, the one who had taught him honor. "What would you have me do now?" Silence answered him. Jon stared into the stone face, remembering the words the dead man had once said. "A man can only be brave when he is afraid." The flicker of torchlight cast shifting shadows along the crypt walls. Jon closed his eyes, recalling that everything good in him came from Ned Stark's teachings. The Targaryen blood might flow in his veins, but it was the Stark sense of duty that guided his heart. That would have to suffice. No matter what new nightmares lurked across the sea, he would face them, for the sake of all those who had already suffered too much. He left the crypts, returning to the castle's main halls. Val was waiting by the entrance, leaning against a pillar, arms folded across her chest. She watched him in silence as he climbed the steps, a question in her eyes. "Needed some time alone?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Yes." She pushed away from the pillar, moving closer. "We all have ghosts we speak to, in our own way." He understood the layers in her words. "Yes, we do." For a moment, the air between them hummed with unspoken sentiment. Then she turned. "Come on, we should get some rest." Sansa said she'll have more news come morning. Together, they walked through the dim corridors, side by side, each lost in their own thoughts of the looming future. Over the next few days, ravens arrived bearing fresh rumors. One letter from Tyrion Lannister confirmed that ships had sailed from Myr carrying mercenaries with strange sigils on their banners, twisting dragon-like symbols that did not match any known house. Another letter claimed that several of the free cities were in uproar, with authorities cracking down on anything that smelled of Valyrian fanaticism. And yet, no one could pinpoint the Scion's true stronghold. They were slippery, operating in shadows. Sansa's intelligence network suggested that a certain Lady Melanie of Liss, rumored to dabble in the darker arts, might be behind some of this. She had apparently invested heavily in caravans traveling into the haunted lands near the ruins of Valyria. Treasures and artifacts returned to her manses on Liss, and from there to other eager buyers. The Crown's spies noted that among her associates were men who professed undying loyalty to the old blood of the Dragon Lords. "If you want a place to start," Sansa said one afternoon, reading from one of the letters, "it might be Liss. Lady Melanie's name has come up more than once. She seems central to these dealings." Jon frowned at the mention of Liss. A city of pleasure houses and pirates. Doesn't seem the obvious place to start a new empire. Sansa set the parchment aside. Perhaps it's only a hub for trade. In any event, Tyrion suggests that if you come to King's Landing, he can arrange a meeting with several captains who've seen this Lady Melanie's envoys. A plan can be formed from there. Val listened intently, glancing between brother and sister. "So we sail from King's Landing to Liss?" Jon considered. "Possibly, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, we need to see if the king or Tyrion has the resources to help. Sailing into Liss unprepared would be a fool's errand." Sansa tapped a finger on the table. "I'll prepare letters of introduction for you to carry, in case you need them. Some lords in the Crownlands might still be unsure about you, but with the king's or the hand's seal, they should not bar your way." Jon inclined his head. "Thank you." She smiled faintly. "Think nothing of it, brother. We Starks have to stand together, even if only one of us is truly a Stark by blood." Jon exhaled, the ghost of old insecurities trailing across his face. "I was raised a Stark," he said quietly. "That's enough." Sansa reached out to place a hand over his. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." On the fourth morning after Jon's arrival, Sansa gave the final order. Horses were readied, cloaks packed with furs, and provisions for the road secured. Winterfell's stable yard bustled with activity. Val adjusted the straps on her saddle, expression unreadable. Jon helped secure Ghost's harness, though the direwolf rarely needed anything. A small retinue of guards in stark livery would accompany them as far as Moat Cailin, but no further. Sansa stood atop the steps overlooking the courtyard. When Jon and Val approached to bid farewell, she pulled Jon into a tight embrace. "Take care of yourself, and of her," she added, nodding toward Val. "And remember, if you need us, send word. We will not abandon you." He took her hand and squeezed it gently. "Thank you, Sansa, for everything." She managed a wry smile. "Just come back in one piece." Then she turned to Val, offering a courteous nod. "Watch over my brother. He can be stubborn." Val smirked. "So I've heard." With that, they rode out of Winterfell's gates, the morning sun casting elongated shadows across the frosty ground. Jon glanced back one last time at the castle that had shaped him. The wind stirred his cloak, whispering promises of a future still uncertain. 4 days, they traveled the King's Road southward. The scenery changed from sparse winter forests to rolling hills and farmland. Villages dotted the landscape. Jon found himself once again recognized by small folk who remembered him as the king in the north, though that was a title he had never fully embraced. Occasionally, they encountered groups of travelers heading north, but the roads were not as crowded as they had been in times of war. They reached Moat Cailin, passing its old ruins. The small escort of Stark guards parted ways, heading back to Winterfell. Jon continued forward with Val alone, and Ghost padding by their side, a silent sentinel. Each mile carried Jon closer to the heart of a realm he had tried to leave behind. He recalled the swirl of politics in King's Landing, the dangerous dance of alliances. Now he returned to it by choice or by necessity. Some nights, he and Val camped beneath twisted weirwoods, their limbs scratching the sky like pale claws. Jon often found his thoughts drifting back to the threat across the sea, to the shape these scions of the flame might take. What if they had truly found a way to hatch dragons? Would they be unstoppable? Could a realm still reeling from Daenerys' devastation rally against an onslaught of new fires? Val, sensing his unease, would remind him of simpler truths. "We'll find the heart of this," she would say, "and either douse the flame or learn to control it." Her confidence was a quiet fortress. She had never seen dragons, nor the horrors of King's Landing under siege, but she had faced the White Walkers and survived. Fear did not deter her. The closer they came to the Crownlands, the warmer the air grew. Snow gave way to patches of muddy ground and brittle autumn grass. One evening, they found an inn near the Rosby Road, where the innkeeper was more than happy to serve the famed Jon Snow, though he nearly choked on his spit upon seeing Ghost. Once they were settled, Val asked Jon to teach her more of the southern maps. She traced her finger along the shapes of the free cities, then the landmass that used to be Valyria. "What was Valyria like before the Doom?" she asked, eyes shining with curiosity. Jon shrugged. "I only know what I've read. It was a place of wonders. Tall towers, dragon lords who forged roads and swords with magic. Then, in a single day, it fell to ruin. They say the 14 flames erupted and drowned it all in fire and smoke." Val frowned at the map. "So these scions, they want to rebuild all that? Perhaps, or at least claim its power. Men are drawn to the allure of dragons." She studied his face. "But the blood of Valyria runs in you, doesn't it?" Rhaegar Targaryen was the last prince to truly embody that tradition. Jon's brow tightened. "I never asked for it." Val's gaze softened. "But do you feel it? The fire in your blood?" He hesitated. In the quiet of the night, he admitted, "Sometimes, there are moments when I dream of flames and wings, when I feel different, but I try to ignore it." She nodded. "Perhaps that's wise. But ignoring something doesn't make it vanish." Jon clenched his jaw. The last time someone had told him to embrace his Targaryen heritage, it had led to war, heartbreak, and devastation. Yet he could not entirely deny the voice inside him that whispered of dragons. He sipped his ale and let the moment pass in silence. At last, they neared the outskirts of King's Landing. The city loomed in the distance, its walls partially rebuilt after the destruction wrought by Daenerys's dragon. Jon felt a chill in his bones that had nothing to do with temperature. Memories of burned streets and ash-choked air hovered at the edges of his mind. They followed the road to the main gates, finding them heavily guarded by the city watch. The gold cloaks halted them, but recognition soon dawned. Word spread quickly, and a messenger was dispatched to the Red Keep. Within an hour, an escort in royal livery appeared, House Stark's direwolf sigil, combined with the new sigil representing King Bran's reign. The mixture felt jarring, a reminder of how deeply things had changed. The escort led Jon, Val, and Ghost through the city. Many buildings bore fresh scars, but reconstruction was well underway. The smell of new lumber mingled with the lingering scent of charred rubble. Crowds parted, some gawking openly at Ghost, others whispering about Jon Snow's return. He heard snatches of conversation. The Targaryen killed the Dragon Queen. A bastion of the North, back to save us? He pressed his lips together, unwilling to dwell on their words. Val's eyes darted about, taking in the chaos of the capital with undisguised fascination. The scale of it was unlike anything she had seen before. Ghost kept close, uneasy amid the bustle and noise. They reached the Red Keep's gates, a monument still undergoing restoration. Jon remembered the last time he stood there. Daenerys's body in his arms, Drogon's roar echoing across the ruined throne room. He shook off the memory, focusing on the present. Guards ushered them into a courtyard where grooms waited to take their horses. A steward approached quickly, bowing. "Lord Snow, the Hand awaits you in the Tower of the Hand. Your companion may join you, of course." Jon dismounted. "Ghost stays with me," he said, voice firm. The steward hesitated, then nodded, eyes wide. Very well. They were guided through winding passages, up staircases that bore newly fitted stone. The keep's interior was a blend of old grandeur and new patchwork. At last, they arrived at a set of carved wooden doors. Guards stepped aside, and the steward pushed the doors open, announcing, "Jon Snow and Val, of the Free Folk." Tyrion Lannister stood at a large table strewn with maps, flanked by several advisors. He looked older, more careworn than Jon remembered. His hair was streaked with silver, and deep lines etched his brow, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. Upon seeing Jon, a fleeting mixture of relief and something like sorrow flickered across his features. "Jon," he said, stepping forward. "You came." Jon inclined his head. "Tyrion, you look well, for a man carrying the realm on his back." A faint smile tugged Tyrion's lips. "I'm glad to see your sense of humor survive the snows. And who is this?" he added, shifting his gaze to Val. Jon made introductions. Tyrion gave Val a polite bow, then gestured to the maps. "We have much to discuss. I'll keep this brief for now, as I suspect you're weary from the road. King Bran will wish to see you soon, but first, let's speak of the matter at hand. These rumored dragon eggs, and the band calling themselves the Scions of the Flame." Jon set his jaw, stepping closer to the table. Ghost padded behind him, sniffing at corners. Val stood at his side, hand resting on the hilt of the dagger at her belt, eyes scanning the faces of Tyrion's advisors. Jon recognized a few. Davos Seaworth, standing near the table with a resigned expression. Brienne of Tarth, clad in armor, silent and watchful, and a handful of others he did not know. Davos inclined his head in greeting. "Jon Snow, been a while." Jon nodded in return, grateful to see a familiar face. "Ser Davos, it's good to see you." Tyrion waved a hand at the maps. "Right, shall we begin? The storm of rumor is building across the sea. We need to decide how best to weather it or end it." And so, in the Tower of the Hand, beneath the battered banner of the crowned direwolf, Jon Snow prepared himself for another reckoning. This time, his adversaries were neither White Walkers nor rebellious lords, but shadows of an empire long thought dead, and the promise of dragons waiting to rise from the ashes once more. If Jon's heritage could help avert a new cataclysm, he would wield it no matter the cost. Yet a subtle, gnawing question lingered at the back of his mind. Could the spark of Valyria within him ignite a renewal of fire that he could neither control nor extinguish? As Tyrion spoke, his voice crisp with urgency, Jon traded a glance with Val. In her eyes, he saw a reflection of his own unease and a stubborn will to press forward. Their path lay before them, hidden in the swirling embers of a power older than the Seven Kingdoms themselves. One step at a time, they would discover whether Jon Snow was destined to snuff out that flame, or to carry it into a new dawn. And if the price proved too high, well, he was Ned Stark's son, whatever else he might be, and he would face the cost with honor. The memory of Daenerys, both her dreams and her downfall, flickered through his thoughts like a warning from the grave. He had walked through fire once. Now the fire threatened to come for him again. Tyrion's voice was low and steady as he explained all that he and the crown had learned in recent moons. He rested both hands on the war table, knuckles pressed into a map of the narrow sea and beyond, small carved markers indicating known ports and rumored gatherings. The flickering torchlight of the Tower of the Hand elongated the shadows of those present. Davos standing near the far corner, arms folded. Brienne in her gleaming armor, silent sentinel to one side, and a handful of younger counselors clutching parchments in their ink-stained hands. "The trouble," Tyrion said, tapping a small figurine positioned near Liss, "is that we can't confirm the size of their operation, nor the exact location where these alleged eggs are being kept. Every whisper points us to Lady Melanie or her associates, but the moment we close in on one lead, it vanishes like smoke." Jon listened in grim silence. Standing beside him was Val, her gaze quietly assessing each person in the room, as if gauging whether they were potential threats or allies. Ghost lay near Jon's boots, tense in the unfamiliar environment, muzzle low to the stone floor. The direwolf had never liked the constraints of castle walls. "I've heard mention of these scions of the flame," said Davos. He scratched at a bit of gray stubble along his jaw. "Sailors out of Pentos and Mere talk about fire worshippers with deep pockets. They pay well for strange artifacts. Dragonbone, old scrolls, rubies, anything that smacks of Valyrian heritage." Brienne's expression remained impassive. Would gold alone suffice to bring half the sellswords of Essos to their banner? Sellswords are one thing, but hatching dragons is another matter entirely. Tyrion exhaled a short sigh. Indeed, the merchant from Pentos who came with those rumors was earnest or frightened. He insisted he saw newly discovered dragon eggs, warm to the touch, not the centuries-old petrified lumps typically traded as curios. Before we could press him further, he vanished. Either the crown's enemies spirited him away, or he fled once he realized how dangerous such claims can be. Jon set his jaw. He remembered with perfect clarity those 3 eggs Daenerys had possessed, thought to be mere stone, until she stepped into the funeral pyre that had birthed living dragons. The memory still dredged up conflicting emotions. Wonder, horror, sorrow. He had loved her for a time, or believed he had. Then everything had unraveled in ash and screams. "If the threat is real," he said quietly, "we cannot ignore it." Tyrion's gaze flicked toward Jon, and for a moment a shared recognition of the past passed between them. Daenerys Targaryen's conquest, the sacking of King's Landing, the final tragedy in the Red Keep. "Quite right," Tyrion replied. "Yet we also cannot sail an army into Essos without proof. The realm is weary of war. Every lord and small folk in Westeros has endured a generation of conflict, from the War of the Five Kings to the Night King's invasion to Daenerys' conquest. We'd risk fracturing the tenuous peace." Jon's mind drifted to the last conversation he'd had with Sansa before departing Winterfell. She had been adamant. Avoid reawakening the realm's scars. Her priority, like Tyrion's, was stability. "Is King Bran certain we should act?" Jon asked. He had yet to see his younger brother face to face since arriving, for Bran's daily schedule was full of audiences and matters of state, and Tyrion had asked for Jon's counsel first. A new voice interrupted before Tyrion could reply. "Yes, said a guard at the chamber door. "His Grace is ready to see you all." The group exchanged glances. Tyrion's mouth corked into something akin to relief. "Then let us present what we know to the king and see what shape his wisdom takes." They filed out of the Tower of the Hand, accompanied by a retinue of gold cloaks. Ghost's nails clicked on the stone floors, and more than one guard kept a wary eye on the direwolf. Jon felt a twitch of unease. The Red Keep had never felt like home, and every corridor echoed with ghosts of the past. Val remained close, matching his stride. She was silent, but the slight furrow between her brows spoke of caution. She was new to these southern intrigues, yet keenly aware that power here took forms different from the raw, wind-scoured survival of the far north. They reached the main throne room. Once, it had housed the Iron Throne, a monstrous seat forged from 1,000 twisted swords. That throne was gone, melted by Drogon's flames after Daenerys's death. In its place now stood a simpler seat of dark wood, carved with swirling shapes reminiscent of branches and raven's wings. King Bran the Broken, as the realm had come to call him, was settled upon it. He looked neither imposing nor grand, a still figure robed in soft grays and whites, his eyes a depthless blue, far older than his body seemed to contain. Around him gathered a modest court, lords, ladies, advisors, and a handful of knights in polished steel. Some turned curious stares on Jon Snow, others simply observed with practiced courtly detachment. As Tyrion stepped forward, the assembled courtiers grew silent. "Your Grace," Tyrion said, bowing, "I bring Jon Snow and Val of the Free Folk, who have come to aid us against the threat across the sea." Bran's gaze slid to Jon and lingered, something faint and sad in his expression. It had been so long since they had truly spoken. When Bran spoke, his voice was quiet yet resonant, carrying easily in the hush. "Welcome back, Jon, and welcome, Val." Jon inclined his head. He remembered a younger Bran, once eager to climb every wall in Winterfell. That boy was gone, replaced by a king whose eyes sometimes saw beyond mortal sight. "I answer your summons, Your Grace," he said, "though I'm not sure how much help I can offer." A faint smile touched Bran's lips. "You have a role to play still. I see that clearly enough." His tone was gentle, yet somehow the words echoed with finality. Then he turned his gaze to the rest of the court. "We stand at an uncertain crossroads. The realm has begun to heal from the last war, but new rumors from Essos speak of a rising power. We cannot allow a second dance of dragons, nor can we allow foreign dragon lords to gain enough strength to threaten peace." One of the lords, Jon recognized him as Lord Grafton from Gulltown, stepped forward, voice edged with worry. "Your Grace, do we have proof of these threats? Or is it all hearsay from wandering merchants?" Tyrion inclined his head. "Much of it is rumor, it's true. Yet if even a fraction holds truth, we face a danger we can't dismiss. There have been sightings of newly hatched dragons in the skies above certain islands near the old Valyrian coastline. Sailors are apt to see sea monsters and mermaids, true, but we must consider the possibility." A murmur rippled through the courtiers. Many wore expressions of skepticism or thinly veiled fear. Dragons remained an open wound in the collective memory of King's Landing. Bran let the hush settle before speaking again. "I have seen glimpses," he said softly, his voice carrying a strange weight. "Shadows across the sea, wings in the night. The future remains in motion, but the threat is real." A chill went down Jon's spine. He knew Bran's powers of seeing were not mere parlor tricks. If Bran said he glimpsed wings in the night, it meant there was reason to believe. Val glanced at Jon, brow slightly raised, as if to ask silently, "Is he truly gifted with magic?" Jon gave her a small nod. Bran continued, "We will not commit the armies of Westeros without reason, but we must learn the truth. Jon, you have experience that no other living soul can match. You have Targaryen blood, yet you were raised a Stark. You rode with a dragon queen. You saw the havoc she unleashed. Now, you understand better than most what is at stake." Jon's throat constricted around an old knot of shame and sorrow. "If I can help prevent a second horror, I will. Bran's eyes flicked toward Val, and he inclined his head. And you, Val of the Free Folk, have traveled beyond the realm's borders, braved the unknown. Your perspective is equally vital. Val met his gaze with quiet poise. I'll do what I must. A slight, warm glimmer touched Bran's otherwise solemn face, as if acknowledging an unspoken bond. Then he turned back to the court. The plan is thus. The Hand will assemble a small delegation to sail for Liss. We suspect that is where the key players in the Scions of the Flame group can be found. Ser Davos has volunteered to oversee navigation. That Davos cleared his throat. I've more experience with Essos than most here, especially Liss and the surrounding waters. If Jon is going, I'll see him there safe. Tyrion added, Ser Brienne has also volunteered to go, though whether we need a full retinue of knights is debatable. Brienne shook her head lightly. I'll keep the delegation safe if need be, but it should be a small party. Fewer swords means fewer tongues to wag that the crown is taking aggressive steps. Bran nodded. Then it is settled. A small party. Jon Snow, Val, Ser Davos, Ser Brienne, and whomever else the Hand deems necessary. They will sail under the crown's banner. We do not seek war, but we must discover if war is coming for us. A shuffle went through the assembled crowd. Some looked relieved at the measured response. Others appeared concerned that it might not be enough. Jon glanced at Tyrion. The dwarf was studying the throne, lost in private reflection. No doubt he remembered journeys across the sea with Daenerys, the forging of alliances that turned to dust. Jon bowed his head to Bran. I'll do my best, Your Grace. Bran's eyes met his with a knowing intensity. Be careful, Jon. Forces older than us stir in the east. They may try to use your blood, your name, for their own ends. Jon's stomach twisted. He recalled how Varys, Tyrion, and others had once pinned their hopes on Aegon Targaryen, as if the name alone would save the realm. Even now, the mention of Targaryen blood felt like a curse rather than a gift. Yet he had come too far to turn back now. When the audience ended, Tyrion quietly signaled Jon and Val to follow him through a side door. Davos and Brienne joined them. They made their way to a smaller reception room with tall windows overlooking the city. Sunlight slanted in, revealing the ongoing reconstruction below. Tyrion poured wine for each of them, sipping his own as if fortifying himself. Then he nodded toward Jon. We'll arrange a vessel. I'd suggest a swift ship, not too large to avoid attention. Perhaps the Sea Swan, a caravel with a good captain. She's known to be quick through the narrower channels around Liss. Davos can confirm. Davos gave a curt nod. I know the Sea Swan's captain, Tarly, a decent man who doesn't frighten easily. Brienne folded her arms, the steel of her gauntlets catching the light. What do we do upon arriving in Liss? Go directly to Lady Melanie's doorstep and knock. Tyrion shrugged. Subtlety is advisable. Liss is full of pleasure palaces, cutthroats, and every shade in between. We'll need to move cautiously, gather information. Find out whether Lady Melanie truly is the power behind these Scions of the Flame, or merely a figurehead. Brienne turned to Jon. We'll need coin, disguises, or at least some plausible reason to be there. If the Scions are watching for foreigners, we cannot blunder around in open steel, proclaiming ourselves the crown's envoys. Val spoke up. You southern folk might not pass easily as commoners, but I can blend in if needed. I've worn furs all my life. A few Lysini robes might draw more stares than I'd like. Her tone was wry, prompting a slight smile from Davos. Jon tapped a finger against the lip of his wine cup. We'll figure out the details on the journey. The key is to confirm whether these eggs exist, and if so, where they are being kept. That's the linchpin. Tyrion's face turned solemn. We must confirm it, yes. If these eggs have already hatched, if there are dragons in Essos, we have to know who controls them. If they're wild or if the so-called Scions of the Flame aim to breed more. The last thing we need is a second coming of the Doom or a foreign conqueror with fire at their command. A hush fell as each person present recalled the destruction a single queen with 3 dragons had wrought, let alone an entire cult bent on harnessing that same power. Jon exhaled. We depart as soon as the ship is ready, then. Agreed, Tyrion replied. I'll have the letters of safe passage prepared and see that the ship is supplied. We want to avoid official fanfare, so keep your presence quiet while in King's Landing. Jon narrowed his eyes at the city visible through the windows. The warren of streets, the muddy rooftops under repair, the teeming harbor. All of it set him on edge. He would rather sleep under the open sky than within these walls. We won't linger, he promised. I'd just as soon leave tonight if the vessel is prepared. Davos chuckled. Might take a day or two, lad. The Sea Swan needs final victuals and fresh water in her casks. But soon enough we'll be on our way. Tyrion set his wine down. Good. In the meantime, I'd suggest you rest, or see whoever you wish to see in the city. Just be wary. Rumors of your return are already spreading. Jon dipped his head in gratitude, then glanced at Val. She seemed relieved that they would soon be gone from the claustrophobic castle. The rest parted ways. Davos planned to head to the docks to speak with the ship's captain, while Brienne spoke with the Red Keep's quartermaster about suitable gear. Jon and Val took their leave, wandering into the castle courtyard. The midday sun glared off stone and scaffold, the laborers calling out instructions as they hoisted new blocks to patch the keep's outer walls. Guards in gold cloaks paced the perimeter. Ghost stayed close, but his ears were pricked, as though uneasy. Jon couldn't blame him. This place held too many violent memories. Val brushed her hand along the fabric of her cloak. So many people, so little space, she observed quietly. I can see why you don't like it here. Jon managed a faint smile. It never felt like home. Winterfell is crowded at times, but it breathes differently. Here, everything is about power and secrets. She studied him a moment, her eyes searching. I wonder if the people here ever truly rest. They look over their shoulders, listening for whispers of betrayal. He shrugged. It's how they survive. They made their way to the royal stables, where Jon hoped to tend to Ghost away from prying eyes. The stablemaster, a wiry man with pox scars on his cheeks, nearly dropped his pitchfork at the sight of the direwolf. Jon quietly asked him for a corner stall that wasn't in use. The man obliged, trembling all the while, though Ghost barely spared him a glance. The direwolf's pale eyes scanned the straw-littered floor, unimpressed. After settling Ghost, Jon and Val walked outside to a quiet patch of the yard. A battered training dummy stood near the wall, wooden swords scattered about. Jon picked one up, testing its weight. Memories flashed of training sessions in Winterfell or in Castle Black's yard. He looked at Val, who had drifted toward the training dummy, curiosity lighting her face. Ever used a southern blade? Jon asked, tossing her the wooden sword. She caught it deftly. Not as often as a good spear or knife, but I'm not ignorant of swords. The free folk just don't always have them, especially not in abundance. She gave the practice sword a brief flourish, testing its balance. Let's see if you're as good as Tormund says. A ghost of a grin tugged Jon's lips. Tormund often boasted about Jon's skill, albeit with typical wildling exaggeration. With a shrug, Jon picked up another practice sword. You'll have the advantage in speed, he warned, stepping into a ready stance. Val's grin sharpened, and before he could second-guess, she lunged, wooden blade whistling through the air. Jon parried easily enough, but her follow-up thrust was cunning, forcing him to pivot. Their wooden swords clicked and thumped, echoing off the courtyard walls. Guards at a distance paused to watch the spectacle. The former king in the north sparring with a wildling woman who moved like a dancer on ice. She nearly scored a hit on his shoulder, but Jon twisted aside, bringing his sword down to block, then sweeping her leg. Val leapt over the sweep, landing lightly. She raised a brow, impressed. Jon pressed the advantage, testing her reactions. She ducked, sidestepped, jabbed. He deflected her blows and countered, though he found himself working harder than he'd expected. Her reflexes were exceptional. After a swift exchange, Val managed to feint high and knock the sword from Jon's grasp with a low strike, sending it clattering into the straw. Breathing hard, Jon lifted both hands in surrender. She grinned triumphantly, a flush coloring her cheeks. You see, Tormund's stories exaggerate. Jon laughed softly, retrieving the wooden blade. Or maybe I'm just out of practice. A part of him welcomed the challenge, relishing the chance to feel alive in the midst of looming threats. You fight well, he complimented, setting the practiced sword aside. She shrugged, though her eyes shone with pride. Growing up beyond the wall, every day was a fight of some sort. He nodded, remembering how Ygritte, too, had possessed that fierce independence. But Val was her own woman, different in countless ways. He felt a sudden warmth for her, an acknowledgement that she had become more than a companion on this road. She was a pillar of strength he hadn't realized he needed. They lingered a moment, catching their breath in the pale midday light. Then a steward approached, clearing his throat. My lord, Jon Snow? The Hand has asked if you would join him for a private meal this evening. He wishes to go over final details. Jon exchanged a glance with Val. Very well, he said to the steward. Where? In his private solar, the steward replied, bowing stiffly. An hour before sundown. Jon nodded. The steward hurried off. Val tilted her head, watching him go. They're all so eager to bow, she remarked. It's unsettling. I wonder how you ever got used to it. I never did, Jon confessed. I tried to outrun it by going beyond the wall, but it seems I can't escape the realm's pull. Val studied his face, then gently placed a hand on his forearm. When this is done, maybe you'll find peace, or you'll be forced into another war. Either way, I'm here. He offered a small, grateful smile. Thank you. They parted then, Val wishing to see more of the castle, though likely she would avoid the busiest corridors. Jon watched her go, his mind restless with thoughts of the mission to Essos, the ancient blood in his veins that might attract dangerous attention. He ran a hand through his hair, sighing. One step at a time, he told himself. He had dealt with White Walkers, betrayals, and dragons. Perhaps he could handle a handful of mysterious cultists, or so he hoped. That evening, Jon made his way to Tyrion's private solar. The door was guarded by a single gold cloak, who stepped aside at Jon's approach. Inside, the room was softly lit by a few lanterns, and a table of modest fare was laid out. Roast quail, crusty bread, a pitcher of wine. Tyrion lounged at the head of the table, swirling a cup of wine in his hand. He gestured for Jon to take a seat. Welcome. I hope you're hungry. It's not the feast you'd find in Highgarden, but it's better than the stale bread we used to eat in the field. Jon settled down, removing his cloak and resting it on the chair. It's more than enough. As Jon reached for the bread, Tyrion studied him with a faint tilt of the head. You've changed. I suppose that's no surprise. We've all changed. Jon tore off a piece of bread. Being forced to kill the woman He paused, swallowing. Well, yes, that would change anyone. But you've changed too, Tyrion. Tyrion's face flickered with regret. I carry the weight of my choices and my failures. I put faith in Daenerys, ignored the warning signs. By the end, the city burned for it. Many died because of that misjudgment. She was not the only one to blame. Jon took a slow breath. She believed she was liberating people. In some ways, she did, but it twisted at the end. I wonder if there was another path for her, or if it was inevitable. A hush stretched. Tyrion sipped his wine, the red liquid catching lamplight. She believed in her destiny, in the righteousness of her cause. Now we face the possibility of new dragons rising. If these scions of the flame succeed in hatching them, we must pray they don't harbor the same zeal. Jon nodded. He recalled the haunting words from Bran. Older powers stir in the east. What do you need from me, specifically? Tyrion put his cup down, leaning forward. Use your name carefully, if at all. In Essos, the Targaryen name once carried great weight, but after Daenerys' campaign and her death, sentiment is mixed. Some might rally behind a Targaryen banner. Others might seek revenge for the chaos she unleashed on the slavers and lords of the free cities. Be mindful. And if the Scions realize who you are, they could try to lure you in or worse. Jon frowned. I have no claim. I want no throne. Be that as it may, men who crave power might see you differently. A Targaryen of the male line, supposedly legitimate, if you accept Rhaegar's marriage to Elia was annulled and replaced by a secret union with your mother, could be used as a figurehead. Tyrion rubbed the space between his brows. I apologize if this stirs old wounds, but we can't ignore the reality of your birth. Jon tried to keep his voice level. I've accepted it, but I won't let it define me. Tyrion's gaze flicked up. Good, then take caution. If we find these eggs, we have to ensure they're not used against the realm. You are the only one among us who's actually been around dragons on a personal level. That might matter. A memory of Rhaegal's hot breath, the warmth of scales beneath him during flight, flashed through Jon's mind. He felt a pang of loss for the beast that died fighting the Iron Fleet. I can't say I learned enough to handle new dragons on my own, but if it comes to it, I'll try. Tyrion gave a faint smile. Thank you. I'll be honest. The realm needs you, Jon. We may not have told you in so many words, but there it is. It needs your sense of honor and your unique perspective. Jon ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble on his jaw. I'll do what I must. I gave up a quiet life in the north for this, but I won't stand aside while the realm slides into another war. Spoken like Ned Stark, Tyrion murmured half to himself. Then he motioned to the food. Come eat. Let's enjoy what little respite we have before the storm. They ate in relative silence. Occasionally, Tyrion made small talk, inquiring about life beyond the wall, about Tormund's latest exploits, about Sansa's efforts in Winterfell. Jon answered briefly, his mind preoccupied with the looming journey. At length, Tyrion poured them both another cup of wine, the pitcher now nearly empty. He raised his cup. To old allies, Tyrion said softly, and to the hope that we can learn from our mistakes, not repeat them. Jon touched the rim of his cup to Tyrion's. They drank, the wine leaving a bittersweet warmth on Jon's tongue. Mistakes. The entire realm was built on them, it sometimes seemed. Yet here they were, still trying to make amends, to hold back the darkness that threatened from the corners of the world. Perhaps that was all anyone could do. The next day dawned with clouds pressing low over King's Landing, a gray gloom matching Jon's mood. He and Val joined Davos and Brienne at the Mud Gate, where the Sea Swan was moored. True to Davos's word, she was a swift caravel, sleek of line with a single tall mast. A small crew bustled aboard, stowing supplies and checking rigging. Captain Tarly was a dark-skinned man in his 50s, with a ring of silver in his close-cropped beard. He greeted Davos warmly, clasping arms in a gesture of old friendship. Then he turned to Jon and Val, offering a courteous nod. Ser Davos speaks highly of you. I trust you won't cause my crew any trouble. Jon shook his head. We'll keep to ourselves. Val took in the ship's rigging with a mix of curiosity and caution. She had never traveled by sea, certainly not in a vessel of this size. Brienne, clad in a lighter set of armor for easier movement aboard, offered her hand to help Val cross the gangplank. Val hesitated, pride rankling, then accepted the help. Ghost needed coaxing to step aboard, baring his teeth at the shifting deck beneath his paws. Once all were aboard, Tarly barked orders, and the crew sprang to life. The lines were cast off, sails unfurled. Slowly, the Sea Swan drifted away from the quay, the brackish smell of the Blackwater Bay filling their nostrils. Jon stood at the ship's railing, watching King's Landing recede. Memories weighed on him. Battles fought in the surrounding waters, the approach of Daenerys's fleet not so long ago. Now he sailed forth in an attempt to prevent the next catastrophe. Davos joined him at the rail, his gaze following Jon's. Sometimes I wish I were just a smuggler again, with no stake in these grand affairs, Davos said quietly. But that's not the way of things. No, Jon agreed. It rarely is. They sailed past the mouth of the Blackwater, into the open waters of the narrow sea. The day wore on. The deck rocked gently, the sails luffing as Captain Tarly found a favorable wind. Brienne spent her time inspecting the cramped quarters below, while Val lingered near the prow, enthralled by the endless expanse of gray-blue water. Jon felt a sense of uneasy calm, a lull before the unknown storms that might wait in Liss. Ser Davos busied himself helping the crew navigate, occasionally explaining maritime basics to Jon. He pointed out the orientation of the sails, the angle of the rudder, the shape of the coastline as they moved southeast. Despite the gloom of the sky, the day remained free of heavy rain, and for that Jon was grateful. Val approached him after a time, her hair whipping around her face in the wind. "It's beautiful," she said. "Terrifying, but beautiful. I understand now why the free folk rarely used ships. The sea is as dangerous as any winter storm." He nodded. "I suppose it is. But it's also freedom, in a way, no roads, no walls, just open space." She looked out at the horizon. "It feels like we've left one world behind and are sailing to another." Jon couldn't help but agree. "Yes," he said, thinking of how the Seven Kingdoms would fade behind them, replaced by the labyrinth of city-states in Essos. Each city had its own intrigues, its own perils, and Liss was known for its indulgence and cunning in equal measure. Their journey took nearly 2 weeks of steady sailing. The weather shifted from overcast to rainy to bright, scorching sun as they traveled farther south and east. Jon found himself shedding his heavier layers, though Val insisted on keeping her furs close. She said she disliked the damp sea air. Davos and Captain Tarly charted a course that avoided the busiest trade lanes, hoping to keep the expedition inconspicuous. They stopped briefly at a small port in the Stormlands to restock fresh water, then continued on. Nights at sea were strangely peaceful, the stars bright overhead, the gentle creak of timber lulling them to a restless sleep. Sometimes, Jon paced the deck while the others slept, thinking of old nightmares, hearing the faint crash of waves. Ghost paced with him, ears pricked for anything amiss. Brienne proved a vigilant sentinel as well, occasionally joining him for a quiet vigil by moonlight. They spoke in hushed tones of simpler days, of Podrick, her former squire, now a knight in his own right, of Sansa's rule in Winterfell, of the uncertain future. Brienne had once sworn to protect the Stark children, and in her eyes, Jon sensed that vow extended to him as well. Val, for her part, adapted quickly to the shipboard routine. She helped mend sails, learned to tie knots from Davos, and once dared to climb partway up the rigging for a better view. At night, she questioned Jon about the cities across the sea, gleaning any scraps of knowledge he had from what Daenerys had told him or from Sam's old lessons in the Citadel's tomes. Jon answered as best he could, but found himself marveling at how much he didn't know. He had visited Dragonstone, White Harbor, Eastwatch, and Hardhome, but he had never spent real time in Liss or the other free cities, save for a brief stay in Volantis during his travels with Daenerys. The world felt vast again. Eventually, the waters turned warmer, turquoise gleams beneath the midday sun. Davos pointed out that they were nearing the waters off the coast of Dorne, soon to cross to the southern approach to Liss. As they continued east, the breezes carried exotic scents, spiced trade winds from the summer islands, hints of saffron from distant convoys plying their goods. The Sea Swan occasionally passed larger galleys or cogs, but Tarly's smaller ships slipped by without attracting much notice. Then, one late afternoon, as the sun sank low and bled orange across the horizon, a silhouette appeared in the distance. An island city rising from the water, dotted with marble spires and pastel-roofed villas. Liss. Val leaned over the rail, eyes wide at the sight of the city's famed architecture, glimmering in the last rays of the sun. White towers soared above the harbor, many crowned with gold cupolas. Manses lined the hills, half obscured by lush gardens and exotic blooms. Jon felt a knot tighten in his chest. Liss was known for its pleasures: bed slaves, high-born courtesans, expensive wines, and lavish feasts. But beneath its veneer of opulence lay treachery. Slavers once thrived here, though Daenerys' campaign had shaken that economy to its core. Some said the city still clung to old ways in secret. If the Scions of the Flame found a foothold, it might be among the wealthy who prayed to see Valyrian might restored, or among the unscrupulous who would pay any price for advantage. Captain Tarly ordered the sails trimmed, guiding the Sea Swan into one of the smaller docks, away from the main wharf. The city's harbor was bustling with vessels from across the known world. Round merchant ships from Pentos, sleek corsairs from the Stepstones, even a few war galleys flying the flags of Volantis. Cries in multiple tongues filled the air. Brightly dressed porters ran to and fro, hawking services, fish and fruit. The smell of brine and sweat mingled with perfume wafting from the open windows of the nearest pleasure houses. John stepped onto the dock, Val and Ghost close behind. Brienne and Davos followed with cautious eyes. Captain Tarly arranged for a berth, paid the necessary docking fees, and promised to keep the ship ready to depart at short notice. "I'll stay with the Swan," he told Davos. "But if trouble's brewing, you'd best hurry back." Davos clasped the man's hand. "I will keep our wits about us." With that, they stepped onto the cobbled streets of Liss. The city's architecture was as graceful as it was deceptive: smooth arches, mosaic facades, statues of lithe figures in poses of eternal leisure. John led the way, guided partly by vague recollections from Daenerys's advisors who had once spoken of Liss. The broad main avenue was flanked by slender columns and fruit trees, the air thick with the sweet smell of citrus. Slender women and men, many clad in diaphanous silks, lounged on balconies overhead, calling out flirtatious greetings to passers-by. Val stared openly, unaccustomed to such displays. Brienne reddened slightly at the boldness of it all. Davos kept his face carefully neutral, though John saw him glance uneasily at Ghost. A large white wolf might attract the wrong kind of attention here. They pressed deeper into the city, where side streets wove through markets selling everything from carved jade trinkets to rare spices. Lyseni guards in gilded breastplates strolled about, though whether they upheld any real law or simply served the local magisters remained unclear. John made sure to keep his cloak's hood partially up, as did Val. The crowds gave them a wide berth when they caught sight of Ghost, muttering in hushed tongues. Some recognized the Northman's garments, or the presence of a Westerosi knight. Brienne's armor was unmistakable, but it seemed they were too preoccupied with their own business to trouble them. They found an inn recommended by Tarly, a place near the water that catered to traders from distant lands. A discreet sign in several languages proclaimed it the Cobalt Tide. Inside, the common room smelled of roasted fish and saffron. The barkeep, a plump woman with kohl-rimmed eyes, welcomed them in a practiced monotone. She barely blinked at Ghost, though she did insist they keep the direwolf at the table's edge. Over a simple meal, John spoke quietly with Davos and Brienne, outlining their next steps. "We need to learn about Lady Melanie," he said, voice low so as not to carry beyond their table. "Word is she owns several estates in the city, as well as a private palace on the outskirts. We should be careful how we inquire." Davos wiped sweat from his brow. "I can ask around the docks, talk to some captains who might have done business with her. But if she's truly the patron of these scions, we can't just stroll up to her door." Brienne nodded. "We'll need an intermediary, someone with knowledge of Lyseni high society. A local mercenary or a broker of secrets, perhaps." Val sipped from a cup of watered wine, her eyes alert. "In the north, we'd simply speak to the leader face to face, but I gather it doesn't work that way here." John gave her a rueful smile. "No, not often, and I doubt Lady Melanie would willingly reveal anything to strangers, especially if she's dealing in contraband like dragon eggs." Davos rubbed his chin. "I'll make discreet inquiries about any shipments that might match that description. Meanwhile, maybe you and Brienne see if there's a gatekeeper to Lady Melanie's circle. A steward or a courtesan or someone who can be bought for a few gold." John paused, glancing at Ghost. The direwolf was licking his paws, eyes half-lidded. "We should keep a low profile. Let's pay for separate rooms here, 2 pairs, perhaps. We don't know how long we'll be in Liss, but I'd rather not wander the streets at night." They agreed. Brienne went to secure the rooms, while Davos stepped outside to glean rumors at a nearby tavern frequented by local mariners. Val stayed with John, finishing her fish stew in thoughtful silence. After a while, she spoke. So this is a city of wonders, but you suspect it hides rot beneath all the perfume and lace. He nodded grimly. Many do. Liss is famous for its beauty and vice. If Lady Melanie is as influential as the rumors say, she'll have eyes everywhere. We must tread carefully. Val leaned in closer. And if we find these eggs, or if the dragons are already hatched? John's gaze dropped to the worn tabletop. Then I hope we can keep them from sparking another war. Killing dragons, I've done it before, but it's not something I ever wish to do again. She studied him, a flicker of pity in her eyes. You carry such burdens, Jon Snow. He managed a small, humorless laugh. It seems to be my lot in life. That night they retired to their rooms. Jon and Val shared one, a modest chamber with a single bed draped in thin, gauzy curtains to keep out biting insects. Ghost settled on the floor, though he kept rising to sniff at the window, where foreign night scents drifted in. Jon lay awake, senses on alert. For a moment, he thought of how different things might be if he had simply refused Tyrion's summons, stayed beyond the wall. But that was not him. The realm, his family, needed him, or so everyone claimed. And something deep inside him could not turn his back on the possibility of dragons rising anew. Val lay beside him, her breathing measured. She had adapted quickly to such closeness, though any deeper intimacy was something they had not rushed. There were too many pressing threats, too many watchful eyes. Yet he found comfort in her presence, a reminder of the resilience of the free folk, their courage in the face of the unknown. Eventually, his eyes grew heavy, and sleep claimed him, though it was restless and haunted by half-formed dreams of ash and swirling flame. In the morning, Davos returned with some scraps of information. Over a breakfast of fruit and spiced bread, he relayed what he'd learned. Seems Lady Melanie is indeed a formidable power here. She's rumored to be older than she looks. Some say she dabbles in sorceries to preserve her youth. She's throwing a gathering tomorrow night in her grand mansion. An invitation-only affair for foreign dignitaries, local notables, and wealthy merchants. Word is, it's a lavish party that might be a cover for other dealings. Brienne pursed her lips. If we could get in, we might overhear something of value. Davos nodded. Or we might vanish without a trace. But it's the best lead so far. Val glanced at Jon. We'll need invitations. Jon turned the possibility over in his mind. Perhaps we can pay the right bribe, or find someone who can bring us as guests. Davos scratched the back of his neck. I spoke to a certain Lyseni official, a man called Ariston J. Rix, who sells introductions for a price. He's known to be slippery, but honest in the sense that coin will buy a favor from him. That might be our best bet, Jon said. We'll have to pose as wealthy merchants or envoys, claim we have goods to trade, or something to show Lady Melanie. But if she suspects we're from Westeros on a mission, we risk losing the element of surprise. Brienne flicked her gaze to Jon. We could claim you're Aegon Snow, an exiled bastard of House Targaryen, looking to sell a rare artifact you found in the north. That might intrigue them enough to gain an audience. Jon's lips thinned. I despise that ruse, but perhaps a variation. We can't reveal the name Targaryen so openly. It might draw too much attention. Val crossed her arms. What about calling yourself a northern lord turned adventurer? That's not entirely false. If Lady Melanie or her associates are searching for relics, you could claim to have knowledge of dragons from your time in the wars. Davos nodded slowly. That's plausible. We just need something enticing enough to interest them. Jon's mind flicked to the glass candles, the dragonglass from Dragonstone. All the lore Sam had once shared. Dragonglass is said to be worthless here except as a curiosity, he said. But knowledge of actual dragons, that might be more valuable. Brienne looked at him pointedly. You did ride one. Jon grimaced. Only briefly, but Lady Melanie doesn't need to know how brief. If she's truly in league with a group that wants to restore Valyria, she might be intrigued by someone who's flown a dragon. Davos began to pace. It's risky. They might just try to kidnap you. Still, if you and Val go in as traveling adventurers, while Brienne and I hang back, we might glean something. We'll be ready to intervene if it goes sour. Val arched a brow. You're comfortable leaving us alone in a den of potential dragon worshippers? Davos's look of wry humor didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm not comfortable at all, but you two have the best chance of passing for mercenaries or rovers from afar. Brienne stands out in her armor, and I've got the look of an old smuggler. Hard to blend at a fancy Lyseni gathering. Jon sighed. We'll do it. But I want Brienne and Davos stationed nearby, in case we need a quick escape. We also have Ghost, though I doubt we can bring him inside the mansion without raising alarm. Val-eyed Ghost, who lay at their feet gnawing on a leftover bone. Better to keep him outside, or else we'll draw too many stares. Jon stroked Ghost's fur absently. Then it's settled. Davos, see if you can pay Ariston J. Ricks to arrange invitations for Val and me. We'll pose as, I'll handle the details, Davos interrupted gently. That's what I'm good at. Jon nodded, relieved to share the burden. All right, let's do it. By midday, Davos returned with 2 invitations in hand, sealed with a golden crest that bore the silhouette of a flame-wreathed figure. Whether it was Lady Melanie's personal sigil or one borrowed from ancient Valyria was unclear. He didn't ask too many questions once I paid him enough, Davos reported. Said the gathering is tomorrow at dusk. Dress well, speak softly, and try not to get yourself killed. Jon examined the invitation. The parchment was perfumed, the Lyseni script curling in elaborate loops. And where is this mansion? Davos set out a rough sketch of the city, indicating a walled estate near the eastern hills. Large gardens, tall colonnades, rumored to be patrolled by private guards. We can approach from the main gate or scale a sidewall. But if you're invited, better to walk in through the door. Brienne and I will watch from outside, see if we can slip in if trouble stirs. Val looked at Jon. What does one wear to a Lyseni gathering? I have only my furs and a few clothes we bought in King's Landing. Jon shrugged helplessly. We'll need something more refined. Let's see what we can find in the local shops. Subtle but not poor. So they spent the rest of the day preparing. Davos and Brienne used some of the coin from the crown's treasury to purchase attire suitable for a minor lord and lady from somewhere in Westeros, a place far enough away that no Lyseni might detect the lie. They settled on plain but decent garments in muted colors, nothing too flamboyant. Jon had no taste for southern finery, but at least the clothes fit better than some ill-spun disguise. Val, when finally dressed, emerged from the inn's cramped chamber with a self-conscious look. She wore a gown of dark blue linen that clung lightly to her frame, with a simpler cut than most Lyseni dresses but far finer than any garment she'd worn before. Her hair was partially braided, away from her face, revealing the delicate line of her jaw. Jon found himself momentarily speechless. She shifted under his gaze, a hint of a smirk twisting her lips. Stop staring. You look almost as out of place in that doublet as I do in this gown. Jon glanced down at his newly purchased outfit, a doublet of charcoal gray, trimmed with silver thread, and breeches of matching hue. He had to admit it felt foreign. We'll both manage, he said quietly. Davos approached, clearing his throat. We'll set out soon. The party starts at dusk, but we want to arrive fashionably late. Brienne, clad in a more modest gown over discreet mail, gave them a once-over. You'll pass, she said, faintly amused. They left Ghost in the care of an innkeeper's boy who, for a hefty bribe, agreed to keep the direwolf fed and sheltered in an enclosed yard for the evening. Ghost was less than thrilled, baring his teeth at being locked away, but Jon calmed him with quiet words and promised to return. As twilight gathered, Davos hired a small palanquin for Jon and Val to travel in. It was a Lyseni custom for wealthy guests to arrive in such style. Jon felt ridiculous stepping inside, sitting close to Val as 4 Lyseni bearers lifted them onto their shoulders. But he reminded himself that appearances mattered in this city of masks. Davos and Brienne followed on foot at a discreet distance, cloaked and blending into the evening crowd. The route wound up marble streets, past villas lit by colored lanterns. Music drifted from balconies, and perfumed breezes teased Jon's senses. The closer they came to Lady Melanie's mansion, the more elaborate the surroundings grew. Flower-laden archways, intricately tiled walkways, golden torches flickering in the dusk. Other palanquins and carriages converged, carrying guests in finery so opulent it made Jon's outfit feel drab by comparison. At the estate's main gate, Lyseni guards in polished breastplates checked invitations. Jon handed over the perfumed parchment, heart pounding. The guard scanned it, frowned slightly at the name Lord Yora of Bear's Edge that Davos had concocted, then waved them through. Inside, the garden sprawled in a riot of color, lit by hundreds of lanterns shaped like glass blossoms. Music wafted from an ensemble playing somewhere near the mansion's grand entrance. The bearers set the palanquin down, and Jon stepped out, offering his hand to Val. She slipped her fingers into his, her palm slightly clammy with nerves. The swirl of guests around them was dizzying. Men and women in flowing silk robes, bejeweled masks, elaborate hairstyles. Servants glided among them, offering trays of wine and delicacies. Laughter and low conversation buzzed like a cloud of insects. Jon felt entirely out of his element. He caught glimpses of pale columns, intricately carved with scenes of mythical creatures, dragons among them. Every detail of this mansion spoke to an infatuation with Valyria's lost grandeur. It made him uneasy. He leaned closer to Val, murmuring, "Stay alert." She nodded, eyes flicking across the crowd. "I see no sign of Lady Melanie yet." They moved deeper into the garden, drifting past clusters of chattering guests. Jon forced himself to adopt a neutral smile, occasionally accepting a flute of wine from a passing servant. Val eyed the proffered drinks warily before taking a single cautious sip. The music grew louder near the main doors, and a line formed as guests were ushered inside. "Introductions," Val guessed under her breath. "They're announcing each guest as they enter the hall." Jon grimaced. "Let's hope we're convincing." They joined the queue. Ahead, a herald with a feathered headdress announced each arrival in a resonant voice. "The magnificent Sarin of Myr and retinue, Lord Varlesso Torgo of Pentos, the esteemed Lady Quinara of the Painted Hills." The line progressed. Jon's pulse throbbed in his temples. Finally, they stepped forward, handing over their invitation. The herald blinked at the note scribbled in Lyseni script, then proclaimed, "Lord Yora of Bear's Edge and Lady Valesia, hailing from the far north of Westeros." Jon nearly cringed at the extravagance of the made-up names, but he kept his composure. Val squeezed his arm lightly, and they walked into the mansion's grand hall. A sea of finery greeted them. Gilded pillars, mosaic floors depicting dragons swirling amid fiery motifs, plush lounges draped in silks. Waiters moved with choreographed grace, carrying trays of sweet liquors, spiced meats, and exotic fruits. The scent of incense hung thick in the air, almost cloying. At the far end of the hall, on a raised dais beneath an arch of carved serpents, stood a woman who could only be Lady Melanie. She wore a gown of shimmering gold thread, her dark hair swept up in an intricate arrangement studded with pearls. Her face was youthful, though something about her eyes suggested a deeper age or at least a wealth of experience. She spoke with a small knot of guests, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach those sharp, calculating eyes. Jon and Val drifted through the crowd, pausing now and again to make small talk. They feigned interest in trivial gossip, mentioning the difficulties of traveling from the north, the intrigue of exploring Liss for trade opportunities. Occasionally, other guests eyed them with curiosity or mild disdain, noticing their simpler attire, but none openly challenged them. Across the chamber, a hush fell as Lady Melanie began to move among her guests, accompanied by two tall men in ornate armor. One carried a slender blade, the other wore a coiled whip at his hip. Bodyguards, evidently. She greeted each cluster of guests in turn, a smile on her lips, but her gaze seemed to assess and weigh each person. Before long, she reached Jon and Val. Up close, Lady Melanie's complexion was flawless, her skin faintly glowing in the lamplight. Her eyes were a piercing emerald green, and when she smiled, her lips curved in a manner reminiscent of a cat. "Good evening," she purred. I don't believe we've met. I am Lady Melanie, mistress of this house. Jon bowed with as much grace as he could muster. Lord Yora of Bear's Edge, my lady, and my companion, Lady Valencia. We're honored by your invitation. Lady Melanie's gaze flickered with amusement. Bear's Edge, a charming name. From the north of Westeros, you say? Yes, near the coasts. Jon lied smoothly, drawing on memories of House Mormont's domain. We've traveled far in search of, shall we say, unique opportunities. Her head canted to one side. How interesting. Then she looked at Val, who regarded her with composed poise. And you, Lady Valencia, what do you seek in Liss? Val returned her smile with one of her own, albeit more restrained. Knowledge, my lady. We have heard this city teems with wonders. We're curious, especially about the legends of dragons once soared by Valyrian blood. A sharper gleam lit Lady Melanie's eyes, but her tone remained airy. Ah, dragons. So many are drawn by those tales. They've become quite the fascination of late. Jon seized the moment. Indeed, I've some personal interest. I once saw dragons in Westeros. Fleetingly, but enough to spark curiosity. Lady Melanie's lips parted slightly. How intriguing. Perhaps we might discuss these sightings in private later. Dragons are a dear subject of mine, you see. For now, please enjoy the party. I hope Liss treats you well. She motioned for a servant to bring them a fresh round of drinks, then inclined her head and swept on to the next group. Jon exhaled slowly, exchanging a loaded glance with Val. It had been a short conversation, but the undercurrent was clear. Lady Melanie was very interested in dragons, and thus in them. They spent the next half hour mingling in the crowded hall, sampling bits of conversation. Snatches of talk hinted at shipments from distant ports, the arrival of mercenaries on Liss's eastern shores, the heightened demand for rare substances. None spoke openly of the scions of the flame, but occasionally Jon caught the word Valyria, uttered in hushed, excited tones. Eventually, a discreet servant approached, bowing politely. My lord, my lady, Lady Melanie requests your company in her private parlor. If you would follow me, please. Jon's pulse quickened. He gave Val a slight nod, and they followed the servant through a corridor lined with paintings of draconic motifs. Flaming beasts twisting across stormy skies. The parlor lay beyond gilded doors, a smaller, candlelit chamber furnished with plush chairs and a low table set with a few decanters of wine. Lady Melanie stood by a tall window, her bodyguards stationed near the walls. As Jon and Val entered, Lady Melanie turned, offering a languid smile. Welcome. Please sit. Would you care for some arbor gold? I acquired a cask before trade slowed between Westeros and Liss. Jon nodded politely. Thank you. He and Val settled onto a cushioned settee. The bodyguards hovered, faces impassive. Lady Melanie poured 3 cups herself, a sign of respect or showmanship. Jon wasn't sure. She handed them each a cup, then took one for herself, sipping delicately. I'm told you've actually seen dragons, Lord Yora. That is rare indeed. I saw them briefly during the Targaryen campaign in Westeros, Jon said, carefully omitting the nature of that war. At a distance, mind you. Her emerald eyes flickered with interest. Which means you were there during that Queen's unfortunate rampage in King's Landing, I presume? Jon felt a spike of tension. He forced a calm nod. It was chaos, but it showed me the sheer power of dragons, something that fascinated me and, frankly, made me wary. A trace of a smile tugged her lips. Wary or enthralled? Val interjected softly. Both, perhaps. Anyone who sees dragons in flight must be awestruck. Yet we know the devastation they can bring. Hence our curiosity about the legends of old Valyria. Is it true that some here in Liss carry on those traditions? Lady Melanie eyed Val with keen scrutiny. Some rumors hold that the blood of Valyria runs strong in certain lines, but the truth is more complicated. The doom scattered the old families, and many died out. Still, she paused, swirling her wine. There are those who study the past, who yearn to reclaim the wonders lost. I count myself among them. Jon's heart thudded in his chest. This was clearly more than mere academic interest. Reclaiming the wonders, he repeated, forcing a mild tone. Is that possible? The doom was centuries ago. Her smile turned secretive. So was the Targaryen escape from Valyria, and yet they forged a dynasty. Who's to say a new lineage could not emerge? The world changes swiftly. Jon chose his words carefully. We've heard rumors of eggs, artifacts from the old world. Some say they've been discovered in the smoking sea, near the ruins. Could such a thing be true? Lady Melanie's gaze lingered on him, weighing his question. Why do you ask? Because if it is true, Jon said, there might be those who wish to replicate the Targaryen queen's conquest, without the mistakes she made. I'm not a friend of war, Lady Melanie, but I can't deny my fascination with the idea of living dragons. She took a slow sip of wine, eyes never leaving him. If you had the chance to see such creatures, would you? Jon nodded, letting the spark of interest he truly felt shine through. Absolutely. Her smile widened. Then you may be in luck. The world is on the brink of a new era. I believe dragons will shape that era, if guided by worthy hands. Val set her cup down, leaning forward slightly. And whose hands are worthy? Lady Melanie's expression grew distant, as if recalling something from memory or from a hidden desire. Those who possess the will to reshape the world, to restore what the doom destroyed. Fire and blood might be the path, but it need not be the path of madness. Jon kept his face impassive, though alarm bells rang in his mind. This was precisely the kind of talk that had led Daenerys to her darkest hour. Where might one find such an opportunity? He pressed gently. Lady Melanie studied him in silence for several heartbeats. The hush in the room felt charged. Then she set her wine aside. I have associates who meet occasionally to share knowledge, to plan. They call themselves, well, it does not matter yet. But if you wish to learn more, I might arrange an introduction. However, it requires trust and proof of your sincerity. Val's eyes narrowed. Proof? Lady Melanie's gaze flicked to the bodyguards, then back to Jon and Val. Join me tomorrow night at my villa by the sea. A smaller, more private gathering than this. Show me you are not spies from the Westerosi crown. No offense, but I must be cautious, and I shall show you wonders. Jon forced a small smile. I understand. We'll be there. Lady Melanie inclined her head regally. Good. I look forward to it. The conversation ended. She dismissed them with a gracious nod, and the bodyguards escorted them back through the mansion's corridors into the garden. On the way, the guard with the whip pressed a small parchment slip into Jon's hand, saying nothing. Once outside, Jon and Val slipped into the throng, hearts pounding. When they found a quiet corner of the garden, Jon peered at the slip. It bore a short message in Lyseni script, presumably directions to the villa. He tucked it away, turning to Val. She's definitely more than she appears. Val grimaced. She practically believes she can command dragons, or help someone else do it. Jon's pulse hammered. We'll go tomorrow, but this time we should have Brienne and Davos closer. If Lady Melanie truly has an egg or a hatched dragon, she might be a direct link to the Scions of the Flame. They left the mansion soon after, slipping away without drawing attention. Brienne and Davos were waiting at a prearranged spot near a fountain outside. The swirl of bright lanterns and chatter receded behind them as they walked, exchanging whispers. When Jon relayed the invitation, Davos's brow furrowed. She wants you alone, no doubt. This is dangerous. Jon agreed. It is, but we have to see what she's hiding. Brienne glanced at the imposing silhouette of the mansion. We'll be close, she assured him. One way or another, we'll get you out if things turn sour. Jon nodded. Let's go back to the inn, plan carefully. Tomorrow, we step deeper into the lair of this self-styled Valyrian devotee. Val slipped her arm through Jon's. And if we find an actual dragon? He closed his eyes for a brief moment, recalling the majesty and terror of Rhaegal and Drogon. Then we'll do what we must to keep it from becoming another harbinger of devastation. They walked through the moonlit streets of Liss, the city's charms curdling into shadows at every turn. Jon felt the old burden in his chest, the Targaryen blood that, to some, made him a rallying point and to others a threat. He could almost hear the ghosts of the past whisper. Another dragon? Another war? He clenched his jaw. Not if he could stop it. They spent the following day finalizing their plan. Davos secured a small boat from a local fisherman, ready for a discreet extraction near the coastline of Lady Melanie's villa if needed. Brienne would conceal herself and Davos in the nearby cove just before sundown, close enough to intervene. Jon and Val again donned their new finery as the hour approached. Val's expression was steeled. She disliked the repeated charade, but understood its necessity. At dusk, they set out on foot, taking a circuitous route through quieter streets to avoid being followed. Once they reached the outskirts of the city, the architecture gave way to private estates perched on the rocky shores, palm-like trees swaying in the ocean breeze. They followed the directions Lady Melanie had provided, eventually coming upon tall iron gates flanked by torches. The gates opened for them without question, as though the guards had been told to expect them. Inside, a winding path led down to a coastal terrace, where a sprawling villa stood against the backdrop of a blood-orange sunset. The sea gleamed below, waves crashing gently on a stony beach. Lanterns illuminated a courtyard filled with statues of dragons, each poised as if in mid-flight. The smell of salt air mingled with the sweet fragrance of night-blooming flowers. Jon and Val stepped onto polished marble floors beneath an open-air colonnade. A few robed figures milled about, their faces shadowed by hoods. No grand party or crowd, just a subdued gathering of perhaps a dozen individuals. Lady Melanie appeared from behind a gauze curtain, radiant in a crimson silk gown embroidered with gold dragons. She smiled in welcome. "Lord Yora, Lady Valesia," she crooned. "You came." Jon inclined his head. "We wouldn't miss the chance to learn more." Lady Melanie's bodyguards were present again, though less conspicuous, posted near the villa's perimeter. One of the robed figures approached, bowed slightly, then withdrew. Melanie turned to Jon and Val. "Shall we walk? The ocean breeze is pleasant this time of evening." She led them along a colonnade that opened onto a wide balcony overlooking the sea. The sky had darkened to a deep purple, the last traces of sunset fading beyond the horizon. Torches in wrought iron sconces provided flickering light. "Tell me," she said softly, pausing at the railing, "what truly draws you to the subject of dragons? You claim to have glimpsed them in Westeros, but your interest seems more personal than mere curiosity." Jon's heart thumped. He had to tread carefully. "Perhaps I see in dragons both the beauty and terror of power. My homeland has endured war after war. I want to understand how such power can be harnessed or controlled, so we do not repeat the tragedy in King's Landing." Melanie's lips quirked. "An admirable sentiment, one shared by many of my associates. We believe that the old Valyrian gifts, fire and magic, need not lead to chaos, if guided by those with the right purpose." Val stepped closer, her gown rustling. "And who decides that purpose?" Lady Melanie turned her gaze out to the sea. "Destiny, some say. Bloodlines, others say. In truth, it's a blend of knowledge, will, and fortune. The Targaryens were not the only family to escape the doom, but they were the most prominent. Their dragons shaped the world. Now, all that remains is scattered bones, unless we awaken them anew." Jon felt the weight of those words. Are you claiming you found a way to hatch eggs?" She gave a cryptic smile. "That is a possibility. Come." She gestured for them to follow her deeper into the villa. They wove through corridors lit by braziers, passing alcoves adorned with tapestries of Valyrian scenes. Great cities of marble and fused stone, dragons dancing among columns of smoke. At length, they arrived at a heavy door guarded by two men in black hoods. They stepped aside at Melanie's nod, and the door creaked open. Within lay a chamber of dark stone, faintly lit by sconces. A raised pedestal stood at the center, draped in crimson silk. Something rested upon it, large, oval, and dully gleaming. Jon's breath caught. An egg. It seemed petrified, but a swirl of faint color danced across its surface in the torchlight, as if the shell were not entirely inert. Val exhaled softly, her eyes widening. "Is that?" Melanie stepped forward, resting a hand on the egg with a strange intimacy. "Yes," she whispered. "A dragon's egg, found in the smoking sea by brave explorers who risked the cursed waters. They brought it to me and we tested certain rites. It grew warm to the touch, flickering with life." Jon's pulse hammered. He recalled the eggs Daenerys had once shown him, similar in shape and texture, though each was distinct. This one bore a swirling pattern of black and deep purple, as though shadows moved beneath its surface. "It's real," he said, voice hushed. Melanie cast him a sidelong glance. "Indeed, and there are more. This is but one. We keep them apart for safety. Too many eggs together can amplify the magic in unpredictable ways." Val swallowed. "Has it shown signs of hatching?" Melanie's face lit with a secret fervor. "Patience is required. The conditions must be perfect. Fire alone is not enough, nor is blood. We must replicate the ancient rites of Valyria, calling upon knowledge gleaned from arcane texts. Soon, though, I believe it will crack and bring forth a living dragon." Jon's mind spun. If this was true, the ramifications were immense. He stepped closer, drawn by a mixture of awe and dread. He reached out a trembling hand, stopping just short of the shell. "May I?" Melanie nodded, eyes shining. "Careful. It's warm." Jon let his fingers brush the surface. It was indeed warm, pulsing faintly, as if with a heartbeat. A rush of emotion hit him. Memories of Regal, of Drogon's roar, of Daenerys stepping from flames. He pulled back. "Where did you learn how to wake it?" Melanie's smile was slow, triumphant. "From those who survived the Doom's legacy. My group, these Scions of the Flame, has scoured lost records, half-burned tomes, spells once used by Valyrian bloodmages. The Targaryens were but one branch of a mighty tree. We tend the roots left behind." Jon forced composure. "And you plan to raise a new flight of dragons? For what purpose?" Her gaze flickered. "For the glory of Valyria, of course. To restore the world to an age of wonder and prosperity. But we will avoid the mistakes of your Targaryen queen. She fell prey to madness and vengeance. We aim for a more enlightened era." Val's voice hardened slightly. "Enlightened? Or just another conquest?" Melanie met her stare. "Must forging a new empire be conquest? Think of it as rebirth. A phoenix rising from ashes, not an empire of slave masters, but of chosen elites. We will guide the realm, not crush it." Jon's skin crawled at how easily she dismissed the moral implications, but he forced himself to remain calm. "And how far along are you? Is this egg the only one close to hatching?" She stepped back, folding her arms. "There are others, some may be further in development. I cannot reveal everything at once, Lord Yora. But if you prove yourself worthy, you might join us. Someone who has seen dragons, who knows Westeros intimately. You could be an invaluable ally." Jon realized with a jolt that she was testing him, probing his loyalty, gauging whether he'd be a convert or a spy. The next words came to him almost automatically, shaped by the necessity of subterfuge. "If you truly can hatch dragons, I'm enthralled," he said, letting a reverent note slip into his voice. "I'd do much to witness a living WRM break from its shell." Melanie studied him, her calculating eyes seeming to see deeper than he liked. Then she turned to Val. "And you, my lady? Do you share his fascination?" Val gave a slight nod. "I do, though I've seen how greed and power can corrupt. If your aims are pure, perhaps we can learn together." Melanie's lips curved, satisfied. "Well spoken. There is a ceremony next week, outside the city, where our order gathers. We will attempt a waking. If you wish to attend, prove your sincerity. Bring me something I value, information, an artifact, something that shows your devotion to the cause. Then I will extend an invitation." Jon's heart sank. A ceremony in a week. That left limited time, and if the Scions planned a hatching, things could spiral out of control. "We'll do what we can," he said. "Thank you for this glimpse." She nodded, pulling the silk cover back over the egg. "Now come. We should not linger too long here. Some of my other associates might grow suspicious." As they followed her back toward the door, Jon's mind raced. He needed to find a way to confirm the location of this ceremony, to involve Brienne and Davos, possibly to destroy the eggs if it came to that. The notion of repeating Daenerys's conquest with new dragons chilled him to the core. But as they stepped into the colonnade, an alarm bell clanged from outside the villa. Shouts rang out, voices carrying on the ocean breeze. Lady Melanie's bodyguards stiffened, drawing weapons. Melanie frowned, turning to one of them. "See what that is." Quickly, Jon tensed, exchanging a glance with Val. Could it be Davos and Brienne? Footsteps pounded on marble. Another guard rushed in, breathless. "Intruders on the shore. We caught them skulking with a small boat. They fled into the rocks. One is a tall woman in armor, the other an older man. The watchmen are pursuing." Melanie spun to face Jon and Val, eyes flaring with suspicion. "Friends of yours, perhaps?" Jon's mind whirled. He tried to keep his face neutral. "We came alone. We have no idea who might be foolish enough to trespass here." She narrowed her eyes. "Do you take me for a fool? Arrest them," she snapped at her guards, "and bring me these intruders, dead or alive. I care not which." The guards rushed off, swords drawn. Panic fluttered in Jon's chest. If Brienne and Davos were captured, it would expose everything. He had to act fast. Lady Melanie turned, a baleful glare upon him. "You come with me. We'll see if you're telling the truth." Jon stepped forward, forcing calm. "As you wish." Val's hand slid to the small blade concealed at her hip. Her posture tensed. Jon gave her a subtle shake of the head, signaling they should wait for a better moment. Melanie beckoned, leading them through the colonnade toward the side of the villa overlooking the rocky shore. Torches flared, revealing a scene of chaos. Several robed figures and guards rushing down a carved stairway toward the water. Jon's heart pounded. Where were Brienne and Davos? He prayed they'd gotten away. Suddenly, a flash of steel among the rocks. Brienne's tall form, sword in hand, fending off two guards. Davos crouched nearby, trying to keep low, but another robed figure advanced with a drawn dagger. Jon cursed under his breath. Lady Melanie gestured wildly to her men. "Kill them! Now!" Time slowed. Jon whirled, grabbing Val's arm. "Run!" he hissed, but the bodyguards blocked their path, blades glinting. Melanie watched with hawk-like intensity, her face twisted in rage. Jon pivoted, feigning a lunge at one guard. The man raised his sword. Val took the opening, striking low with her concealed blade, slicing the guard's thigh. He staggered, howling. Jon wrenched the sword from his hand and, in one smooth motion, knocked him unconscious with the pommel. The second guard lunged for Val. She danced back, unencumbered by fear, her northern reflexes swift. Jon parried the man's next strike, steel clashing. The guard was skilled, but Jon's training as a brother of the Night's Watch and in the wars had honed him. He twisted the blade free, pivoted, and slammed the man's head against a marble column with a sickening thud. Lady Melanie screamed, stepping back. "Traitors!" Jon wanted to subdue her, but more guards were rushing in. "We need to go," he hissed to Val. She nodded, breath ragged. They bolted along the terrace's edge, vaulting over a low railing onto a narrow path that led down toward the shore. Behind them, Lady Melanie's shrill commands spurred her men to chase. Torches bobbed in pursuit. Stone steps descended in a zigzag. By the time Jon and Val reached the bottom, they saw Brienne and Davos cornered against the crashing waves. 3 robed figures advanced with weapons drawn, while a guard closed from behind. Brienne's sword flashed in the torchlight, holding them at bay, but they were clearly outnumbered. Jon shouted, charging the robed figures from behind. Val dashed beside him. One robed man spun too late, Jon's sword took him in the side. Val ducked under another swipe, driving her blade up into his ribs. Davos let out a gasp of relief, lunging at the final robed figure, grappling him until Brienne finished him with a swift stroke. The guard from behind roared, charging with a raised spear. Brienne turned, battered the spear aside, and bashed him with her shield. The man toppled onto the rocks. Jon stepped forward to ensure he stayed down. By then, the rest had scattered or lay wounded. Blood pounded in Jon's ears. He turned to Brienne, noting a shallow cut on her arm. "Are you all right?" he demanded. She nodded, breathing hard. "Yes." Davos took a hit in the shoulder, though. Davos pressed a hand to a bleeding gash, wincing. "Nothing fatal, I think." Val glanced up the cliffs. Torches glowed higher up, the shouts of more guards echoing. "We have to go. Now." Jon saw a small boat bobbing near the rocks, half pulled up on shore. That must have been their planned escape route. He grabbed Davos's free arm, helping him to the boat. Brienne shoved the prow into the water. The waves were choppy, but they had no choice. They piled in, Jon and Brienne hastily taking up oars. The surf threatened to smash them against the rocks, but with effort, they rowed out, ignoring the pain and the swirl of the sea. Torches flickered overhead as Melanie's men scrambled to the cliff's edge, hurling curses and threats. A few arrows whistled down, splashing into the water. One thunked into the boat's prow, but they managed to pull away from the immediate danger. Panting, soaked by sea spray, they navigated around a rocky outcropping until the torchlight was lost behind the cliff. Only then did Jon allow himself to exhale. He turned to Davos, whose face was pinched with pain. "Let me see." Val helped carefully peel back the torn fabric. The wound was a ragged slash along his upper shoulder, bleeding but not spurting. "We'll need to bandage it," Val said firmly. Brienne rummaged for the small pouch of supplies she had brought. "Let me do it. Row, Jon. We have to get to the ship or back to the city." Jon nodded, adrenaline still coursing through him. He pulled at the oars, guiding the little boat away from the cliffs. The moon had risen, giving just enough light to see the watery expanse ahead. Val crouched, scanning for any sign of pursuit. None was evident for the moment, though Lys's twinkling lights were distant. As the boat bobbed and pitched, Jon's mind reeled. They had found a genuine dragon's egg, near to hatching. Lady Melanie and her Scions of the Flame were closer than ever to unleashing a new terror. Yet they'd had to flee before learning the exact location of the upcoming ceremony. Brienne finished binding Davos's shoulder, her voice taut. "We can't stay here in Liss. They'll be hunting for us now." Davos sucked in a shaky breath. But we can't leave either, not without dealing with those eggs. We must warn King Bran. We must do something." Jon's jaw tightened. "We'll go back to the Sea Swan, weigh our options, then decide whether to sneak back in or sail for help." Val pressed a hand to Jon's shoulder in quiet solidarity. They all understood the stakes. The tide was turning, literal and metaphorical. If the Scions succeeded in hatching multiple dragons, the realm could burn again. Or perhaps these new aspirants would crown Jon, forcibly or otherwise, in the name of Valyria reborn. The thought made his blood run cold. In the distance, the faint silhouette of Lys's harbor glimmered under the moonlight. Each pull of the oars carried them closer to whatever came next. A desperate fight to snuff out the embers of a second Valyrian empire before they roared into full flame. And as they drifted across the moonlit sea, Jon couldn't escape the feeling that he was once again standing at the edge of a precipice, torn between his duty to protect the realm and the inexorable pull of the dragon's call in his veins. The longboat rocked under Davos's steadying hands, its hull scraping over a sudden rise of submerged rock. A wave struck the prow, spraying brine across everyone inside. Jon sucked in a sharp breath as salt stung his eyes. He blinked through it, peering into the moonlit distance. The lights of Liss had grown distant behind them, but the silhouette of Lady Melanie's cliffside villa still rose against the dark sky, a brooding shape that seethed with the echoes of shouts and pursuit. At any moment, Jon expected to see torches bobbing along the shoreline, more guards emerging to hunt them with vengeance. In the gloom, he could just make out Val's profile as she kept watch from the bow. Her hair, loosened in the scuffle, clung to her cheeks in damp strands. Behind him, Brienne continued to grip or even as she favored her left arm, now scuffed and bleeding through the rents in her gown. Davos hissed through clenched teeth each time the small boat lurched, clearly in pain from the shallow slash across his shoulder. Yet he never let go of his own or guiding them away from the rocky approach near the cliff. At last, they navigated around a craggy outcropping, and the sea opened up in a calmer expanse. The deeper water glistened with moonlight. Jon felt a knot in his chest begin to loosen, though not by much. They were free of the immediate danger, but the weight of what they had discovered pressed on him like an iron band. A dragon's egg, near hatching. More eggs hidden elsewhere. And an entire cult, these Scions of the Flame, devoted to restoring Valyria's ancient dominion. That Lady Melanie had survived so long, weaving a web of alliances in Liss, was proof enough of her cunning. Val twisted back to look at him. "I see no sign of pursuit on the water," she murmured. "They must not have had boats ready." Jon exhaled. "Let's hope that's the case. But it won't take them long to organize. We need to get back to the Sea Swan or somewhere safe. Davos, can we circle around to the harbor unseen?" Davos shifted, biting back a grimace. If we keep low and row around the eastern promontory, we'll avoid the city's main channels, but it'll be slower going. The tide's not in our favor." Brienne wiped a streak of blood from her cheek, her breath still ragged from the fight. "Better we take our time than row straight into a patrol." No one argued. Jon took in or from Brienne to ease her burden. Shoulder to shoulder with Davos, he rowed at a steady pace, letting the night swallow them. Time stretched in heavy increments, each stroke sending a dull ache into his arms. The reality of the threat they faced gnawed at him. He'd known about the rumors, dragon eggs, Valyrian loyalists, but the sight of that single egg, radiating warmth, had reawakened old memories of Regal and Drogon, of unstoppable fire raining from a bright sky. He couldn't let it happen again. They slipped past the rocky coastline in silence, the boat occasionally shuddering as waves slapped its sides. A brisk wind cut across the water, chilling them despite the mild southern climate. Jon kept his eyes on the horizon, searching for the faint glow that might mark Liss's harbor lights. Eventually, a scattering of lanterns became visible to the west. The city itself was raucous even at this late hour, lamplight flickering in its labyrinthine streets. Davos directed them to a smaller, disused quay near the warehouse district, a place where fewer watchmen lingered. He and Brienne had scouted it days earlier in case they needed a quick, unobserved route in and out of Liss. Proved invaluable now. They slipped in among half-rotted pilings and tethered smaller vessels, bumping gently against a barnacle-crusted dock. Jon clambered out first, legs stiff from the cramped boat, then helped Val up. Brienne followed, testing her balance carefully before hauling Davos to his feet. He let out a muffled groan at the strain in his injured shoulder. "Hold on," Brienne said, her voice hushed. "Let's bind that better, Ser Davos." "Just Davos," he reminded her, bracing himself on a pylon. "But if you've a strip of cloth, I'll not refuse it." Val rummaged in the battered satchel she'd carried, a relic of their infiltration outfits, and found a length of linen. With practiced care, Brienne peeled back Davos's torn shirt, revealing the gash beneath. It still bled sluggishly, but not enough to be life-threatening. She wrapped the wound firmly, securing it with a knot. Davos winced but nodded his thanks. Jon kept watch, scanning the deserted quay for any sign of watchers. The city soared just beyond, a tangle of rooftops under the moonlit sky. No sign of immediate pursuit, though he wondered if Lady Melanie's men might arrive later, searching for them. "We should move," he said softly. "Where's the Sea Swan?" Davos gestured with his good arm. "Moored a short walk from here, near the second pier. Captain Tarley said he'd keep it ready in case we needed to flee at short notice." "Good," Jon said. "Let's go." They huddled together, stepping carefully onto the uneven boards of the old dock. A few stray cats scattered at their approach, mewling in protest. Beyond the waterfront, the city's nightlife beckoned in flickers of torchlight and drifting music. But this quarter was quieter, home to hidden warehouses and the occasional smuggler's cove. They reached the next pier without incident. Dim lanterns revealed the shape of the sea swan, her single mast standing proud against the sky. A watchman on deck spotted them, tense for a moment, then signaled recognition upon seeing Davos. Moments later, they were hoisting themselves aboard. Captain Tarly emerged from the shadows, features drawn. "You're wounded," he observed, eyeing Davos's shoulder. "And the rest of you, you look like you've seen ghosts." "You could say that," Jon muttered. Val helped Davos onto a crate so he could sit. "We need to set sail soon, Captain," she said. "The situation here is dire. Lady Melanie will come for us." Tarly frowned, his brow creasing. "Leave Liss? But have we accomplished our mission?" Jon exchanged a glance with Brienne and Davos. "We've discovered enough to know the threat is real, bigger than we imagined. Lady Melanie has a near-hatched dragon egg, and there may be more. The cult behind her wants to restore Valyria, meaning they want to raise new dragons, possibly multiple clutches, and wield them as they see fit." Brienne tucked a stray blonde lock behind her ear, the borrowed finery now torn and blood-splattered. "We have to stop them, but we need resources. An entire army might be too large to muster for an incursion into Liss." She paused. "King Bran needs to hear about this as soon as possible." Davos set his jaw. "We could sail back to Westeros, but that might give the Scions the time they need to hatch the dragons. We'd return to find half the free cities under their dominion." Tarly's expression darkened. "You're stuck between needing help and not wanting to leave them to their devices. A tricky spot indeed." Jon closed his eyes, trying to calm the swirl of conflicting thoughts. If they hurried back to King's Landing, the cult might vanish into the shadows or move up their plans. But staying alone in Liss, they were outmatched and hunted. "We might consider an alternative. Is there anyone in Essos who could help? Another city with a stake in ensuring Liss doesn't become a dragon stronghold." Davos nodded slowly, wincing as he shifted. "Volantis might be the largest power in the region, but they can be unpredictable. Pentos, Mir, Tyrosh, none are truly stable allies. Bravos might help, but they're far to the north." "What about the local Lyseni authorities?" Brienne asked. "Surely they don't want a warlike cult operating under their nose." Tarly snorted. "The local magisters are as corrupt as any in the free cities. Lady Melanie likely has half of them in her pocket. The rest fear her." Jon sighed. "Then we're left with few good choices. We either gather help from Westeros or attempt to sabotage ourselves." Val, who had been silent, stepped forward. "We have one advantage. Lady Melanie doesn't know who we truly are. She suspects we're not simple travelers, but she hasn't discovered Jon's real identity. Nor does she likely know we're working with the crown. We might still exploit that." She paused, her hazel eyes scanning the deck. "She said there's to be a ceremony in a week where they'll attempt another hatching. If we can find the location, we might infiltrate, destroy the eggs, or sabotage the ritual. If we succeed, they'll be set back months, maybe years." Brienne frowned. "It's dangerous, but we'd strike at the heart of their operation." Davos forced a thin smile. And if we succeed, we might buy time to get word to King Bran before they recover. If we fail, well, we might die, or worse, become fodder for a freshly hatched dragon." Tarly ran a hand over his gray-streaked beard. "If you choose to stay, I can't guarantee the sea swan's safety in this port. Lady Melanie's influence runs deep." Jon thought a moment. "Could you dock at some neutral spot on the coast, outside Liss's direct jurisdiction? We might slip in and out without returning to this harbor." Tarly nodded grudgingly. "There's a small inlet to the south used by fisherfolk. It's mostly free of Lyseni patrols. I could keep the Swan anchored there, hidden by the rocky shoals. But if trouble arises, it'll take a day or more for me to sail back here." "That might be enough," Jon said quietly. We either succeed in a sabotage mission within that time, or we meet you at the inlet if we can. If we don't return, sail back to Westeros, warn the crown. Don't risk yourself or your crew for us." A heavy silence settled. Brienne's features were taut. "Jon, are you sure about this? A handful of us against an entire cult." Jon met her gaze. "I'm not sure, but we've come this far. If the Scions hatch multiple dragons, the entire realm, both realms, Essos and Westeros, could be plunged into chaos. We need to try." Davos leaned forward, resting his good hand on his knee. "We can't let them bring a new wave of dragons into the world unchallenged, especially not under the banner of Valyrian supremacy. I'll do my part." Brienne nodded slowly, acceptance in her eyes. "Then I'll stand by you." Val exhaled, relief and tension mixed in her stance. "We do this together." Jon looked at them each in turn, heart swelling with gratitude for their courage, even though fear gnawed at him. "Then we'll plan. First, we need a safe place to rest and treat wounds. Then we gather information. Somehow we must learn the ceremony's location. Lady Melanie likely won't hold it in her villa again. Too risky. She said it would be outside the city." Tarly cleared his throat. "There are smugglers' dens in the countryside. Perhaps the ceremony will be in some remote ruin or an estate no longer in use. Liss is full of hidden corners for such devilry." Jon nodded. "We'll have to ask around. Carefully. Perhaps the same broker you used for the invitations, Davos Ariston J. Ricks. He might know more if we pay him well." Davos grimaced, pressing lightly on his bandaged shoulder. "He'll jack up his price if he senses our desperation. But it's worth a try." With their course set, albeit precariously, Jon turned to Tarly once more. "Captain, can you have your crew ready to sail at first light? We'll stay aboard tonight if that's all right. We need rest and fresh supplies." Tarly patted the railing. "This deck's cramped, but you're welcome to it. I'll do as you ask, though I pray this madness doesn't see us all drowned or burned. I've no love of dragons." "Nor do I," Jon murmured. They parted, each heading to find a corner of the ship to rest. Val lingered a moment at the rail, gazing back at the faint glow of Liss's skyline. Jon joined her, inhaling the salt air. Overhead, the moon carved a pale path across a sky riddled with stars. The sea shifted below, glimmering with faint phosphorescence. She touched his arm lightly. "You're troubled." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "When am I not?" She nodded, her gaze turning inward. "I remember stories the free folk told about dragons, how once, long ago, they believed the wall kept not just wildlings out, but also dragons if they ever returned from the south. They said dragonfire would melt the ice and drown the north. Now I've seen a real egg. I'm beginning to think our old tales weren't so far-fetched." He studied her face, etched in moonlight. "If they succeed, the entire world changes. I can't let them replicate what Daenerys did. Or worse." A gentle breeze teased strands of her hair across her cheek. "Neither can I. Let's stop them, Jon Snow, before this madness spreads." He placed his hand over hers, feeling her warmth. "We will." They stood there for a time, letting the hush of the sea calm them as best it could. Yet beneath the gentle sway of the deck, Jon's mind churned with grim possibilities. Danger loomed. They were venturing into the lair of a new threat that could dwarf any mortal army. But he was Ned Stark's son, whatever else he might be by blood, and he would not shrink from high as duty. Eventually, they turned in, drifting into a fitful sleep. Ghost, who had been left behind at the inn, remained on Jon's mind, but Davos had arranged for the direwolf's safe passage aboard the Sea Swan at dawn. Jon trusted the innkeeper less than he trusted a pit viper, but there had been no other choice in their frantic escape. Night gave way to the gray hush of morning. The crew stirred, preparing to depart. Brienne's injuries were minor enough that she could still move freely, and Davos bore his pain in stoic silence. By first light, they slipped out of Liss's harbor, sails catching a gentle breeze that carried them along the coast. They did not go far, just enough to place a stretch of open water and a few rocky outcroppings between them and the city's gaze. Then Tarly guided the sea swan into the hidden inlet he'd mentioned, an indentation in the shoreline overgrown with seagrass and sheltered by 2 jutting promontories. The crew anchored in relative calm. Jon insisted on returning to Liss in a small group, using one of the ship's rowboats. Davos, Brienne, and Val volunteered to go with him. Ghost, newly reunited with Jon after the innkeeper's boy rowed him out, loped restlessly around the deck. The plan was for Ghost to remain with the sea swan until they secured a better hiding spot in the city. A giant white direwolf would draw immediate notice. While the crew made final adjustments to anchor, Jon, Val, Davos, and Brienne gathered in a cramped corner of the hold, sorting through what gear they had left. Their infiltration clothes were torn and blood-stained, so Davos had procured simpler attire. Plain linen shirts, sturdy trousers, and travel-worn cloaks that might help them blend in with common travelers. Brienne had a half-helm and lighter armor piece for her chest, concealed under a large cloak. Jon strapped Longclaw to his side. The familiar weight of the Valyrian steel sword a grim reminder of what might come. They agreed on a plan. Brienne and Davos would circle the city's perimeter to find Ariston J. Rix again, gleaning from him the location of the rumored ceremony. Meanwhile, Jon and Val would slip into the side alleys near Lady Melanie's main mansion or other known properties, listening for chatter among her staff or associates. With luck, one approach or the other would yield the crucial information on where the cult intended to hold their next attempt at hatching a dragon. It was dangerous, but splitting up might cover more ground quickly, and time was running short. Captain Tarly lowered a rowboat, and they descended carefully, each armed and tense. They rowed out of the inlet in silence, hugging the coastline, the gulls circling overhead with mournful cries. After nearly an hour of cautious paddling, they reached a secluded beach south of Liss, scattered with driftwood and seaweed. They beached the boat, hauled it out of immediate sight behind a dune, and set out on foot through the sparse shrubbery. The city rose ahead in a haze of sunlit spires. The day's warmth began to set in, and Jon could taste the salt on the breeze, mingling with the faint perfume of Liss's exotic flora. Davos turned to Jon. "Let's meet at midday near the same dockside tavern we used before, the Cobalt Tide. If things go well, we'll have news." Jon nodded. "If you're not there by late afternoon, we'll come looking." Brienne offered a curt nod. "Be careful." Val slipped her knife into a hidden sheath along her thigh and fell into step beside Jon. They separated, Brienne and Davos taking a more inland route, while Jon and Val angled toward a cluster of humble dwellings and storage yards near the southwestern edge of Liss. They found the outskirts quiet, the few locals milling about, mostly fishers and laborers. To blend in, Jon and Val affected weary postures, as though they'd arrived from a long journey. Whenever possible, they listened to conversations drifting from open windows or workshop doorways. They heard typical gossip, the cost of bread, a dispute between 2 merchants, rumors of storms at sea. Nothing of dragons or secret ceremonies. As they went deeper, the architecture became more lavish. Marble arches gave way to delicate terraces dripping with flowers. The Lyseni wealthy strolled in fine silks, sometimes with slaves trailing behind carrying parcels. Jon felt a pang at the sight. Daenerys had abolished slavery in so many parts of Essos, but Liss was known for backsliding into old habits. They skirted close to Lady Melanie's primary mansion. A high garden wall enclosed it, vine-covered and formidable. Guards patrolled inside, their shadows visible through the tall iron gate. Jon counted at least 4 in view. The place seemed subdued in daylight, as though recovering from last night's intruders. He and Val lingered across the street, feigning interest in a street vendor's fruit stand. "I see no sign of Lady Melanie," Val murmured, biting into a plum she'd purchased. This juice trickled down her chin. "But that guard patrol is tighter than before." Jon nodded, scanning the corners. "They'll be watching for us, or any outsiders who snoop too close. We should move on. Maybe we can find one of her servants in a nearby market or tavern." They wandered along the next street, where a few lesser courtiers or wealthy hangers-on lived. At a small cafe with an awning of bright yellow cloth, Jon overheard a snippet of conversation between 2 Lyseni men in refined attire. "House arrest, I heard," Lady Melanie's closed her doors to visitors. Something about a sabotage attempt last night. Truly? Word is some northern Sellswords attacked. She's furious. Jon exchanged a glance with Val. It was confirmation of how quickly the rumor spread. They stayed discreet, not meeting the men's eyes, merely sipping water offered by the cafe's proprietor. When the men departed, Jon and Val tried to pry more details from the proprietor, a middle-aged woman with silver-dyed hair. She pursed her lips. "Yes, I heard she's having a fit," the woman said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "But who among us can challenge Lady Melanie? She's practically an institution here. If you're wise, you'll stay away from that estate." "We intend to," Jon said. "But can you tell us more about her? We're new in Liss and keep hearing her name." The proprietor shrugged. "A wealthy patron of the arts, they call her, but everyone knows she dabbles in forbidden things. Strange caravans coming and going at odd hours. Deals with dangerous folks from across the sea. Now that her guards have been tested, I suspect she'll lock down everything." Jon forced a polite smile. "Thank you. We'll heed the warning." Leaving the cafe, Val frowned. "Not much. Everyone's too frightened to speak openly. She must have them cowed." Jon rubbed the back of his neck, the tension building. "Let's see if Davos and Brienne fare better with Ariston J. Rix. If we can't find anything else, we'll head to the Cobalt Tide." They spent the next hour probing different corners of the market district, scanning for any sign of Melanie's underlings or rumored signs of the flame. The morning sun climbed higher, scorching the streets. Finally, as midday approached, they trailed back to the dockside. The Cobalt Tide's faded sign creaked overhead. Inside, the tavern was dim, the smell of stale beer mingling with fish stew. A few patrons hunched over tables, half dozing. Jon and Val secured a corner table, ordering cool water and a loaf of bread. Time crawled. After nearly half an hour, Brienne and Davos still had not appeared. Jon tried not to let worry consume him. Perhaps they were delayed. Perhaps Ariston played hard to get. At last, the door swung open, letting in a shaft of bright light. Brienne stepped through, scanning the room. Davos followed, looking decidedly worse for wear. The bandage on his shoulder had fresh blood seeping through, and his face was tight with fatigue. Jon stood, ushering them over. "Seven hells, what happened?" Brienne looked around for eavesdroppers before easing herself onto a bench. "We found Ariston J. Rix all right, but the man demanded triple the usual price just to speak. Then, when we tried to haggle, he took offense or suspicion. I'm not sure which, and his men turned aggressive." Davos settled down, wincing. "We had a scuffle, managed to pay enough to stop them from killing us outright, but one of them got in a lucky cut." He gestured at his shoulder. "Nearly reopened my wound from last night." Val shook her head grimly. "What about the information we need? Did you learn anything?" Brienne exhaled. "Ariston claims the next ceremony is happening not in Liss, but outside the city in a ruined amphitheater called the Theater of Sorrows. It's about a day's ride north along the old coastal road. It was built centuries ago and mostly abandoned after a plague. Now it's apparently used for clandestine gatherings." A spark of hope lit Jon's chest. "Did he say when?" "A week from now, actually less, 6 days. Just as Lady Melanie mentioned," Davos said, rubbing his temples. "He claims the Scions plan a major ritual. Possibly another egg will be hatched if the conditions are met. He wasn't certain, but he's heard rumors of caravans transporting firewood, which might be code for something else. Up that way." Jon's mind raced. "If that's the place, we can get there ahead of them. Maybe sabotage it or at least scout the area. But a day's ride, we'd need horses." Brienne nodded. "And a plan. If the Scions arrive in force, we can't fight them all. Especially if they have Sellswords or local enforcers. We'd have to strike stealthily. Destroy or steal the eggs, if possible, or sabotage whatever magical apparatus they're using." Val tapped a finger on the table's worn surface. "And if the egg hatches before we can stop it?" A shudder passed through Jon. "Then we face a newborn dragon. Still vulnerable but dangerous. We do have Valyrian steel Longclaw, but I don't relish the thought of confronting even a hatchling. The mother was unstoppable at King's Landing. Davos grimaced, massaging his injured shoulder. The Targaryens of old used dragon horns, or so the stories claim, to bind dragons to their will. But we have none of that, and we're only 4 people. Silence fell, the enormity of it pressing down like a thundercloud. Outside, a gull screeched. The tavern's other patrons remained absorbed in their own affairs. Brienne cleared her throat. There might be a way to disrupt the hatching. Daenerys hatched her eggs in fire, but also with blood magic, right? Jon recalled the night of Khal Drogo's funeral pyre, the songs of the Dothraki, the presence of witchcraft. Yes, that's how it happened for her, though she was unique. Targaryen blood, the conditions were specific. She walked into the flames unburnt. This Lady Melanie might be trying something akin to the old Valyrian rites. Blood magic, sacrifice, or arcane chants. Val clenched her jaw. So if we can disrupt the ceremony at a critical moment, deny them the flame or the blood they need, maybe the egg won't hatch. Davos nodded, though his eyes were shadowed. Worth trying, but they'll have watchers and wards. We must be cunning. Jon leaned forward. We'll do it. We'll go to this theater of sorrows ahead of time. Scout the ruins. Lay a trap or plan how to strike. If we succeed, we break their momentum. Then we can sail back to King's Landing with proof, or at least a story compelling enough to rally the realm. The other 3 looked at him, each face etched with determination, fear, and a hint of hope. It's decided then, Brienne said firmly. They paid their tab, discreetly left the tavern, and retrieved the rowboat from the quiet side of the quay. The city, bright under midday sun, stood oblivious to their desperate schemes. But within a week, if the scions succeeded, Liss, and perhaps all of Essos, would hear the roar of a newborn dragon. That evening found them back aboard the Sea Swan, anchored in the hidden inlet. Captain Tarly listened in grim silence as they explained their new plan. They would ride north in secrecy, attempt to sabotage or destroy the egg at the amphitheater, and return. Tarly, in turn, would remain with the ship for as long as prudent, but if a week passed with no sign of them, he would sail back to Westeros to warn King Bran. Jon requested that Tarly disembark him, Val, Davos, Brienne, and Ghost at a point on the coast closest to the old coastal road. Then they would purchase or steal horses from a small fishing village. Tarly reluctantly agreed, though his caution was evident. "Don't die out there," he said, voice rough. "I'm too old for burying friends." Jon placed a hand on the captain's shoulder. "We'll do our best." Before dawn the next day, they weighed anchor. The Sea Swan slipped out of the inlet, hugging the coast as they sailed north. The hours drifted in tense anticipation, the hiss of waves beneath the hull offering scant comfort. Jon spent part of the journey honing a plan with Brienne and Davos, though so much depended on unknown variables. How many scions would attend? How well armed were they? Would Lady Melanie be there personally? Val, for her part, helped watch over Davos's wounds, rebandaging his shoulder when needed. She also took time to feed and groom Ghost. The direwolf disliked shipboard life, pacing restlessly, but he seemed happy to remain near Jon. Shortly after midday, Tarly pointed out a strip of rugged shore where they could land. It lay near a faint path that supposedly linked with the coastal road further inland. The region was sparsely inhabited, too rocky for extensive farming, cut by hidden coves once used by pirates. Perfect for clandestine rituals, Jon thought grimly. They disembarked onto a narrow beach, the Sea Swan's rowboat creaking as it hauled them ashore. Tarly and a pair of oarsmen helped them carry supplies onto the sand. Dried food, water skins, rope, and basic camping gear. Ghost bounded onto the beach, shaking sand from his fur. Brienne tested the weight of her sword belt. Davos grunted as he hefted a small satchel. Val secured her dagger and a short, curved sword she'd picked up in Liss, a local style with a single cutting edge. Jon strapped Longclaw across his back. Tarly gave them each a last, somber look. 7 days, he reminded them, and then I return to Westeros. I'll keep watch as best I can. Jon nodded, grasping the captain's hand in thanks. We'll meet again. They parted, Tarly's oarsmen rowing back toward the waiting sea swan, which would then move to a slightly deeper anchorage to avoid detection. Soon, the four of them, plus Ghost, were alone on the stony beach. A warm breeze carried the scent of wild herbs from the nearby cliffs. "All right," Jon said. "Let's find that path." They trudged across loose stones and patches of wiry grass until they reached the craggy rise. Sure enough, a faint trail wound upward. After half an hour of climbing, they emerged onto a plateau that sloped gently inland. Here the land was more fertile. Small copses of trees, pockets of farmland, and rolling hills. The coastal road, as rumored, lay just beyond, a dusty track that paralleled the ocean a mile or two inland. They pressed on, the sun beating down. By late afternoon, they came upon a small village, a cluster of huts, a modest stable, and a tumble-down inn. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, and goats milled near a rickety fence. This was where they hoped to acquire horses by coin or cunning. Davos grimaced, massaging his bandaged shoulder. "I'd prefer to pay rather than draw attention by stealing. Let's see if they'll sell a few mounts." Brienne nodded. "We don't want trouble. We can't risk the local lord or guards pursuing us." They approached the inn, which was little more than a large wooden structure with a patchy thatched roof. An elderly man sat on a stool outside, whittling a piece of wood. He glanced up as they neared, taking in their weapons with a wary eye. "Afternoon," Jon greeted. "We're travelers in need of horses. Do you know where we might buy or rent some?" The man spat a bit of tobacco. "Horses, eh? We've only a few. Belong to old Garrex. Don't see many strangers in these parts." "Why do you need 'em?" Davos piped up, voice friendly. "We're heading north for trade, hoping to catch a caravan. Our friend here," he nudged Jon, "has coin to pay. No trouble from us, I promise." The old man snorted softly, but he pointed with his knife. "Stables yonder. Talk to Garrex if he's awake. He might name a price. Doesn't see many deals, so he'll try to fleece you." They thanked him and moved on. Sure enough, they found a modest stable behind the inn. Little more than a thatched lean-to with 4 stalls, 2 of which were empty. In one stall, an aging chestnut mare munched on hay. In the other, a younger dappled gray flicked its tail nervously. A gaunt man with missing teeth was brushing the mare. He turned at their approach, eyes narrowing. Brienne took a step forward, removing her helmet to seem less intimidating. "We'd like to buy or rent your horses." He eyed their gear suspiciously. "Where you headed?" "North," Jon said simply. "We have coin." The man scratched his stubbly chin. "Humph. 50 gold each if you want 'em." Val let out a low whistle. "That's robbery." The man shrugged. "Don't sell 'em often. Don't care if you say no. You can walk." Jon considered haggling, but they had no time for a drawn-out dance. If they offended the man too greatly, they might leave empty-handed. He pulled a small pouch from his belt, counting out coins they'd brought for just this purpose. Mostly Lysini crescents and a few Westerosi dragons. The man's eyes glittered at the sight. "We'll give you 60 total for both," Jon offered, careful not to show the rest of their money. The man haggled, insisting on 75, but eventually they settled on 65. With a grin that revealed his missing teeth, he tossed them some rope halters. "They ain't war horses, mind you. The gray's skittish. The mare's old, but they'll get you up the road." Jon nodded, patting the mare's flank. "She'll do." They led the horses out, saddled them as best they could with basic tack the stableman provided for another handful of coins. Ghost eyed the animals warily, sniffing the air, but the horses only sidestepped, uncertain of the large wolf. Jon gave Ghost a reassuring pat on the head. Outside, the old man from the inn watched them, his expression a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Jon, Val, Davos, Brienne, and a direwolf were not the sort of travelers one saw every day. Yet he said nothing as they mounted up, Davos and Brienne sharing the chestnut, Jon and Val the gray, though they expected to switch off as needed to rest the animals. With a few final nods, they rode north, the setting sun casting long shadows across the rolling hills. The road was not well traveled, but they occasionally passed a cart or a lone traveler, each of whom gave the group a wide berth. As dusk gathered, they found a sheltered spot off the path, concealed by a copse of twisted pine trees. The ground was covered in pine needles and soft moss. They made camp quickly, no fire, to avoid drawing attention. Instead, they ate dried rations by moonlight. Ghost prowled the perimeter, sniffing and occasionally lifting his head to catch the scents carried on the breeze. When they settled, Brienne volunteered for the first watch. Davos needed rest for his healing wound. Val and Jon spread their cloaks on the ground, leaning against each other for warmth. The night air was cool, but not as biting as the North's. Still, a chill seeped in, and the events in Liss weighed heavily on Jon's mind. Before sleep claimed him, he murmured softly to Val, "If we fail to stop this, if the egg hatches and they breed more dragons, the realm might never recover." She pressed closer, her voice equally quiet. "Then we won't fail." He wished he shared her certainty, but in her presence he found a glimmer of hope. Despite the fear gnawing at him, he let exhaustion pull him under, dreaming fitfully of swirling fire and echoing roars. They set out at first light, urging their horses along the gently winding coastal road. The land grew sparse. Rocky outcroppings jutted from the earth, and the smell of the sea lingered on the wind. They guessed they had another day's ride to the rumored ruins of the Theater of Sorrows. Throughout the morning, they passed few travelers, mostly peasants carrying bundles of dried herbs or leading goats. None gave them trouble, though some stared at Ghost as if he were a demon from a tale. By midday, they halted near a shallow stream to water the horses. Davos changed his bandage again, a grimace etched on his face. Brienne scanned the horizon. "If Ariston was truthful, we should be close by tomorrow. Let's keep our eyes open for any turnoffs or hidden paths that might lead to those ruins." Jon agreed, tugging gently on the mare's reins. She snorted, tossing her head. "We might also see wagons or riders heading the same direction. The cult will have to bring in supplies." Val bit her lip. "Let's hope we spot them before they spot us." They pressed on. By late afternoon, the sky began to darken with pregnant clouds rolling in from the sea. A gusty wind whipped across the landscape. The horses grew restless, sensing a coming storm. As the first droplets of rain pattered against the dusty road, they glimpsed a dilapidated signpost by a fork in the path. Faded lettering in some local dialect indicated the left fork might lead to an old settlement. Could be the route to the amphitheater. Jon called a halt. "We should see where that goes." Davos looked up at the roiling clouds. "But maybe not tonight. That storm's about to break. We'll need shelter." Brienne pointed ahead. The shape of a tumble-down inn or hostel sat at the crossroads, mostly boarded up. A single lantern glowed in a front window, flickering feebly. A small stable leaned precariously in the wind. They approached cautiously. Rain now fell in sheets, turning the road to mud. Ghost's coat grew slick, and he shook himself irritably. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The building looked half-abandoned, shutters missing, roof sagging. Yet a sign read, in Lyseni script, "Wayfarer's Rest." Jon dismounted and carefully approached the door. He knocked. Silence. Then footsteps from within. The door creaked open a crack, revealing a wiry woman with a face lined by years of hardship. She eyed the group warily. "We're travelers," Jon said, raising his voice over the rain. "Need shelter for the night. We can pay." She glanced behind her, as if checking for something. Finally, she opened the door enough to let them in. "Not much to offer," she warned. "Few rooms left unbroken. But if you have coin, I won't turn you away." They led the horses into the rickety stable, ensuring they were fed with musty hay. Ghost kept to Jon's side, hackles partially raised. He seemed uneasy. Once inside the main building, they saw the common room was nearly empty. A single smoky hearth provided dim light. Water dripped from holes in the roof. The woman introduced herself as Kessia. She named a price in Lyseni crescents that was not outrageous but still high for such meager accommodations. Davos, too tired to argue, paid her. She motioned them upstairs, cautioning that only 2 rooms were somewhat intact. "No stealing," she muttered, "or I'll fetch the men from the village." Jon kept a close eye on her as they ascended. Something about her manner set him on edge, fearful, defensive. But it was not unusual for lonely innkeepers. Perhaps she'd been robbed before. The upstairs corridor was lit by a single lamp. Rain drummed on the roof, threatening to burst through the rotted boards. They found the 2 rooms. Each had a single bed with stained linens, a rickety chair, and a shuttered window. Brienne volunteered to share one with Davos. Jon and Val took the other. Ghost curled up by the door, ears perked. Val dropped her pack, exhaling. "This place is barely a step above sleeping in the rain, but it's better than nothing." Jon agreed, though a disquieting feeling tugged at him. He opened the shutter a fraction, peering into the gloom outside. Lightning flashed, illuminating the fork in the road. For a moment he thought he saw movement, a distant shape on the left fork, maybe a wagon. Then darkness swallowed it. He closed the shutter. "We'll rest tonight, leave at first light. The amphitheater might be a few miles down that path. If others are traveling there, we have to remain unseen." Val sank onto the creaking bed. "I'll be glad when this is done." Jon rested a hand on her shoulder. He understood her weariness. The weight, the subterfuge, the sense that they were dancing on the edge of disaster. "Me too," he murmured. Thunder rattled the windows, and the rain poured without mercy. In the dead of night, Jon jolted awake to Ghost's low growl. Lightning lit the cracks in the shutters, revealing Val stirring at his side. Jon sat up, heart pounding, and reached for Longclaw. The old floorboards in the corridor creaked under a stealthy weight. He rose, pressing a finger to his lips for Val to remain silent. Ghost was already at the door, ears flattened. In the flicker of lightning, Jon glimpsed a shadow slipping under the crack in the door. Someone outside, maybe crouching. Without warning, the door slammed open. A figure lunged in, brandishing a short blade. Ghost snarled and sprang forward, sinking teeth into the intruder's forearm. The attacker let out a muffled scream, dropping the knife. Jon lunged with Longclaw, but the corridor behind them roiled with more motion. Shouts erupted from Brienne and Davos's room. A clash of steel rang out. Another attacker? Val dashed forward, grabbing the attacker's dropped knife, while Jon tried to subdue the man pinned by Ghost. The intruder wore dark, rain-soaked clothes, his face half hidden by a cloth mask. He struggled wildly. Ghost's jaws clamped down on his wrist, drawing blood. 2 more figures emerged in the corridor. One brandished a curved sword. The other carried what looked like a cudgel. They advanced, hissing something in Lyseni. Val met the swordsman's charge, parrying with the stolen blade. Sparks danced as steel clashed, lightning flickering through the shutters. Jon, twisting free, brought Longclaw up in a tight arc to block the cudgel-wielder's strike. "Val, behind you!" he barked. Another figure emerged from the gloom, a dagger poised to strike her back. She spun, cursing, and caught the blade on the edge of her sword. But the swordsman took advantage of her divided attention, slicing a shallow cut across her upper arm. She hissed in pain. Ghost tore at the first man's arm again, forcing him to roll away, howling. The corridor was chaos. From the other room, Brienne's voice boomed, "Davos, get down!" followed by the crash of splintering wood. Jon slammed his shoulder into the cudgel wielder, sending the man stumbling backward into the hallway's flimsy railing. With a quick thrust, Jon sliced across the attacker's chest. The man collapsed, eyes wide. Val, outnumbered, fought with ferocity. She ducked a slashing blow, ramming her hilt into the swordsman's temple. He staggered, letting her whirl and jam her blade into the other figure's thigh. That one crumpled with a guttural cry. Jon whirled just as the swordsman recovered, raging. He lunged for Val, but Ghost sprang in, jaws snapping at the man's leg. The swordsman lost balance, and Jon ended it with a swift, merciful thrust to the heart. Lightning flared again, illuminating the carnage. Breathing hard, Jon grabbed Val's arm. "You're hurt," She brushed him off. Just a graze. Blood seeped through her sleeve. From the next room, footsteps pounded. Brienne emerged, sword in hand. She was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, but her eyes were fierce. Davos followed, holding a bent dagger, his bandage fully soaked red now. "They attacked us too," Brienne said, scanning the hallway filled with moaning or still bodies. One of the assailants lay dead in the doorway to their room. Kessia, the innkeeper, peeked from the stairs below, face white with terror. "What in all the gods' names is this?" she whimpered. Jon kicked away a fallen blade. "We'd like to ask the same. Did you know these men?" She shook her head violently. "No, I swear I didn't. They arrived earlier, said they wanted to pay for rooms. I had no reason. Oh gods." She trailed off, eyes flicking to the sprawled bodies. Davos panted, pressing a hand to his reopened wound. "They might be Lady Melanie's hired knives, or local brigands who recognized we have coin. Hard to say." Brienne pushed back her damp hair. "We can't stay. They might have more allies." Val grimaced. "I need to bandage this arm, but I'll be fine." Jon turned to Kessia. "We have no quarrel with you, but if more come, we can't protect this place. We're leaving." Kessia looked on the verge of tears, but she nodded. "Go then. Take your trouble with you." They collected their gear hastily, stepping over groaning attackers. One tried to rise, but Ghost growled, and the man sank back, trembling. Outside, the storm raged, thunder rolling across the black sky. Rain pummeled the yard, forming thick mud. The stable, battered by wind, clattered in protest. Brienne and Davos rushed to retrieve the horses, who were spooked by the storm and the noise. Jon helped Val wrap a strip of linen around her wound, tying it off with trembling fingers. "You sure you can ride?" he asked, concern flooding him. She mustered a grin. "I've dealt with worse in the north. Let's just get out of here." Moments later, they were mounted, leading the frightened animals into the downpour. Ghost bounded alongside, mud splattering his white coat. Kessia watched from the inn's porch, looking smaller than before. When they reached the fork in the road, they veered left, following the sign that hopefully led toward the Theater of Sorrows. The sky flashed again, revealing a winding track that disappeared among stunted trees. Lightning rent the heavens, thunder cracked, and they rode into the tempest, hearts pounding with the knowledge that they had enemies at every turn. Dawn arrived slow and sullen. The storm finally relented, leaving the world sodden and gray. The track was a mire of mud, forcing them to move at a walk. Their clothes were soaked through. Brienne shivered, exhaustion etched on her face. Davos's wound was clearly bothering him, though he gritted his teeth and said nothing. Eventually, the road crested a ridge, and they looked down upon a shallow valley. The partial outlines of weathered stone buildings stood in the distance, ruins from some forgotten era. Beyond those crumbling walls, the land rose again in a sweeping curve, crowned by what looked like a semicircle of columns. Even from here, it was clear that the structure had once been grand. Rows of stone seats, an amphitheater battered by time and the elements. Val drew her horse up beside Jon. "That must be it, the Theater of Sorrows." Jon took in the crumbling arches, now draped in moss and vines. Time and neglect had eroded its majesty, leaving behind a lonely testament to a civilization lost. Perfect place for secret rites. They dismounted in a copse of trees, deciding to approach on foot to avoid detection. Brienne and Davos found a sheltered hollow where the horses could be tied under minimal cover. Ghost panted, sniffing the air as though searching for threats. Moving carefully, they made their way through the ruined outskirts. What had once been a small settlement now lay in silent disrepair. Half-collapsed walls, empty doorways, tree roots cracking ancient pavements. Rain dripped from broken roofs, forming puddles where frogs croaked. The amphitheater itself loomed at the far end, partial walls rising in a grand arc. In places, it seemed open to the sky, the seats broken by creeping vegetation. They paused behind a low wall to survey the area. No signs of immediate activity, no campfires, no posted guards. Perhaps the Scions hadn't arrived yet. But in the distance, a narrow road fed into the amphitheater from the north, suggesting an easier approach. Davos crouched, pressing a trembling hand to his shoulder. They'll be here in a few days. We can use that time to scout, lay traps, or sabotage. But we also need to rest and heal. Brienne frowned. Where can we stay hidden, though? If they send scouts early, we'll be found. Val scanned the abandoned settlement. We might find an intact building, one with a roof. We can conceal ourselves. Ghost can keep watch at night. If anyone arrives, we'll see them first. Jon nodded. Let's do it. They spent the next hour prowling the ruins, eventually discovering a half-collapsed townhouse built around a central courtyard. Its roof was mostly gone, but one corner room still had enough shelter from the elements. After clearing debris, they made it somewhat livable. Broken furniture provided scraps of wood for a small, smokeless fire once night fell. Exhausted and soaked, they stripped out of their wet outer layers. Brienne used a portion of her cloak to partition a corner so she could tend her injuries in relative privacy. Val unwrapped the bandage on her arm, revealing an angry gash. Jon gently washed it with the last of their precious clean water. She sucked in air at the sting. He applied a rudimentary salve Davos carried, then rebound it with fresh cloth. "Thank you," she murmured, eyes flicking to his. "Feels better already." Jon gave a slight nod. He reached for the canteen, realizing it was nearly empty. "We'll need fresh water," he said. There was a stream in the valley, but it might be muddy from the storm. Brienne, finishing her own patchwork first aid, approached. "I'll go. Davos needs rest. Val's arm is cut. Jon, you've been pushing yourself too. But I'm still..." She caught herself before claiming to be uninjured. "I can manage," she finished firmly. Jon frowned but knew she was right about Davos needing rest. "All right, take Ghost with you for safety. I'll keep watch here with Val." They waited until Brienne and Ghost headed off, an empty skin slung over her shoulder. Davos huddled against a corner, already dozing. Despite the cold infiltration of damp air, exhaustion claimed him. Jon and Val examined the amphitheater from their vantage within the townhouse. Through a gap in the courtyard wall, they could see the top of the half-circle stands. Birds occasionally wheeled overhead, but no sign of people. "Hard to imagine a great festival here," Val said quietly. "This place feels haunted." Jon knew what she meant. The hush carried an ancient sadness. If the Scions want seclusion, it's perfect. They settled down, waiting for Brienne's return. Jon's mind churned with speculation about how exactly the Scions would attempt hatching an egg. Lady Melanie had mentioned archaic Valyrian rites, that it wasn't just fire but also blood and magic. If she and her cult possessed the knowledge gleaned from half-burned scrolls, they might indeed replicate Daenerys's feat. His gaze drifted to where Davos slept fitfully, sweat beading on the older man's brow. The wound must be infected, or at least inflamed by so much strain. They'd have to find better medicinal herbs soon, or risk losing him to fever. Anxiety gnawed at Jon, but he forced himself to remain focused. When Brienne finally returned with Ghost, the day had advanced into late afternoon. She bore water in a skin, along with some bracken and a few stunted root vegetables she'd found near the stream, possibly remnants of an old garden gone wild. Ghost trotted behind her, muzzle damp. She set the water and vegetables on a broken table, panting softly. "Any sign of watchers?" Jon asked. She shook her head. "No, but I found tracks near the northern road, wagon ruts, fresh from this morning. Likely they're bringing something. Could be nothing, or could be the cult's supplies." Val shot Jon a look. "We need to see what they're hauling." He pressed his lips together. "Yes, but we should move cautiously. Let's wait until dusk. We can circle around. If they're camped nearby, we might see it." Brienne agreed. "I'll come with you. Davos should rest. Val, your arm could use more healing time." Val started to protest, but Brienne cut her off gently. "You're fast with a blade, but you'll need that wound to mend if we're facing a larger fight." After a moment, Val relented, though the frustration showed on her face. Fine, but be careful. They spent the next hours quietly tending to tasks. Val forced Davos to drink water and eat a little. Jon and Brienne sharpened weapons. Ghost lay in a shadowy corner, ears flicking at every distant sound. The sun dipped behind ragged clouds, painting the ruins in sullen oranges. At last, twilight spread across the valley. Jon and Brienne crept out, swords belted, cloaks pulled tight. The amphitheater loomed ahead like a giant skull. They skirted the edge of the settlement, picking a path through toppled columns and partially collapsed walls. Shadows lengthened, rendering the sight eerie in the half-light. They advanced toward the northern road, pausing whenever the wind rustled the brush. At one point, Jon thought he glimpsed a flicker of torchlight, but it disappeared behind a stand of gnarled trees. They moved closer, crouching low. Ahead, the road curved around a rocky slope. The remnants of a large archway, once marking the city limits, stood cracked in the gloom. Beyond it, faint glows bobbed in the darkness. Lanterns, the shapes of two wagons, stationed side by side, with silhouettes moving around them. Brienne motioned for Jon to get down. They pressed behind a fallen chunk of masonry, peering over the edge. Ghost, who had followed them at a distance, kept behind, alert but unseen. Men bustled around the wagons, half a dozen or more. A faint voice carried on the breeze. Jon thought he heard the Lyseni tongue, along with snatches of common. Crates were being lifted off the wagons and carried somewhere off the road. Another silhouette hovered, giving orders in a clipped tone. As Jon's eyes adjusted, he recognized something. The glint of an ornate helm, possibly a guard from Liss, or the private guard of Lady Melanie. They seemed to be hauling heavy loads. He counted 8 men in total, though more might be unseen. Brienne nudged Jon's arm, pointing. One of the men stepped into a patch of lantern light, revealing a black cloak embroidered with a faint design. Something serpentine or draconic. Jon's breath caught. The Scions. They watched as the crates were moved into the brush. Then the silhouette of a taller figure emerged from the darkness. A woman's shape. She spoke briefly to the men, though her voice was too soft to carry. Jon caught the faint swirl of a robe or cloak, possibly red or dark purple. Then, with a firm gesture, she dismissed the men, who continued their work. The woman retreated up the slope. Where was she going? Jon squinted, noticing a side path that might lead around the amphitheater's perimeter. Brienne leaned close, her breath warm on his ear. Should we follow her? Or check the crates? Jon weighed the options. They risked being seen if they trailed the woman directly. The crates, he whispered. We need to know what's inside. Maybe more eggs. Brienne nodded. Together, they inched around the rubble, taking advantage of the gloom and the men's focus on the wagons. When the men were momentarily preoccupied, lifting a particularly large crate, they darted from cover to cover, at one point lying flat behind a broken statue. Their hearts pounded in unison. At last, they reached a cluster of low shrubs within a stone's throw of the wagons. Jon spied a smaller crate off to one side, unguarded momentarily. If they moved quickly, they could peek inside. They waited for the men to haul the large crate away. The moment they disappeared up the slope, Jon and Brienne dashed forward. Jon crouched by the smaller crate, leveraging his dagger under the lid. Brienne kept watch, hand on her sword. The lid creaked, nails pulling free. Inside lay bundles of cloth. Jon gently peeled one back. His pulse jumped when he saw the contents. Glass vials of a thick, resinous substance. A pungent odor rose, something like pine and pitch but sharper. Possibly a flammable mixture. He replaced the cloth, glancing at Brienne with alarm. Some kind of accelerant? Fuel for a big fire? Or a ritual flame? She nodded grimly. They planned to burn something, likely the egg. Distant voices made them freeze. 2 men approached, their lanterns bobbing. Jon carefully eased the crate lid back into place. He and Brienne melted behind the wagon just as the men arrived. The big crates heavier than expected, one said in Lysini. Careful, it might break. The other spat. If that happens, Lady Melanie'll have our heads. I think there's an egg in there, or so the rumor says. Jon's blood ran cold. Another egg. Possibly the one they intended to hatch here. Brienne's eyes flicked to Jon, her expression fierce. He offered a minuscule nod, indicating they'd learned enough. They needed to withdraw. But the men lingered, rummaging in the wagon's front. The small crates have the black powder and oils. Let's hurry up. I don't want to be out here all night. Jon's muscles tensed. Black powder, oils, potent mix. If used in a ritual or combined with other arcane steps, it might replicate the pyre that hatched Daenerys's eggs. They had to sabotage it somehow. The men turned to follow their comrades up the slope, leaving the wagon momentarily unattended again. Jon took the risk, sliding out from behind the wheel. Brienne followed. They darted away from the road, deeper into the gloom of the ruins. Once safe behind a collapsed wall, they took a moment to catch their breath. Ghost appeared, silent as a specter, pressing his muzzle to Jon's hand. Brienne whispered, "They're definitely planning a hatching. Another egg is here, maybe more. And they have flammables to replicate a pyre." Jon clenched his jaw. "We have to destroy the supplies or the egg. But not tonight. They'll be on guard soon." She nodded. "We can do it closer to the ceremony. If we strike now, they'll suspect sabotage and hide everything better." Jon rubbed a hand over his face, the weight of it all almost suffocating. "We'll wait. We have a few days. Let them set up. Then we strike when we can cause maximum disruption." Lightning forked in the distance, illuminating the crumbling amphitheater once more. In that flash, Jon pictured how a newly born dragon might shriek to life there, a nightmare of flame and fangs. Resolute, he squeezed the hilt of Longclaw. They wouldn't let it happen. They retreated to the ruined townhouse, navigating carefully through the labyrinth of rubble. Night had fully fallen by the time they slipped inside. Val and Davos were awake, worry etched on both faces. Davos had a feverish cast to his skin, sweat beading on his brow, but he managed to sit upright. Jon and Brienne relayed what they discovered. Wagons carrying flammables, men referencing an egg, Lady Melanie's probable presence. Val paled. "So it's real. They truly intend to hatch one here." Jon nodded, his mouth dry. "In 6 days or fewer, the Scions will gather for a ceremony, just like Lady Melanie hinted. We saw no sign of her specifically, but a woman in a cloak might have been her. They plan to do it in the amphitheater. We have to sabotage them." Davos coughed, then forced out words. "We strike on the night of the ceremony itself. That's when the egg is most vulnerable, right?" "Likely," Brienne said, "but we'll need a plan to handle dozens of cultists." Val touched her bandaged arm, eyes hardened. "We're but 4, but we have the element of surprise. Maybe we can set off their own flammables early, cause confusion." Jon weighed the notion. If we ignite their black powder, we could destroy the egg before it hatches. But if we're caught in the blast... He let the implication hang. Davos tried to shift position, wincing. "We'll have to be careful. Slip in, place a torch or flint at the right spot, then get out. If that fails, we use our steel. We can't let a hatchling survive." Ghost whined softly, sensing the tension. Val stroked the direwolf's neck. "We should rest. We have days ahead to refine the details." Jon sighed. "Yes, let's prepare. We'll keep watch tonight in shifts. Davos, try to sleep. Brienne, I'll take first watch. Val can follow." They lit a small, shielded flame from the last of their dry tinder, enough to provide minimal warmth without sending smoke or light swirling into the night. The ruins groaned occasionally as the wind buffeted ancient stone. Rain dripped from sagging beams, forming little puddles in corners. Jon settled near the courtyard gap, sword across his lap, as the others dozed. Ghost lay beside him, ears perked. The hush of the abandoned city weighed on his soul. Once, he had thought the fight against the White Walkers would be the last great battle for humanity's fate. Then came Daenerys's rampage, which had ended in heartbreak. Now again, a new doom loomed, one woven from old Valyria's ashes. He wondered if he was destined never to find peace, if the realm would always demand more of him. He thought of Sansa, of Tormund, of the simple freedom he had tasted beyond the wall. But duty called him back again and again. His mind drifted to Daenerys, how she had once been an idealistic breaker of chains before succumbing to the siren song of absolute power. Would Lady Melanie be the same, if she seized a living dragon? Or was she already worse, cloaked in shadowy magic and ruthlessness? Exhaling, Jon gazed at the tattered sky. A few stars managed to pierce the lingering storm clouds. He prayed silently. Let me do what's right this time. Let me save those who cannot save themselves. The night wore on. In the gloom of shattered stones, he listened for footfalls or distant voices, but only the sigh of wind responded. Eventually, he woke Val for her watch. She rose, still wincing from her wound, yet determined. He drifted into a shallow sleep, plagued by dreams of monstrous wings flapping over the amphitheater. At dawn, they planned the sabotage in earnest. Day by day, more cultists and supplies trickled into the ruins. From their vantage in the townhouse, Jon's group watched as tents were erected near the amphitheater. Each evening, more wagons arrived, often escorted by guards in black cloaks embroidered with cryptic dragon-like insignias. The numbers swelled. By the third day, at least 36 men and women were camped around the amphitheater, making no secret of their presence. No local authorities appeared to challenge them, further proof that Lady Melanie had Liss or the surrounding region under her sway. The cultists moved freely, setting up altars, hauling firewood and braziers, and marking runes on the amphitheater's stone floors. Once, Jon glimpsed a crate being carried carefully, as though it contained something precious. He couldn't see inside, but he guessed it was the egg. They placed it near the center of the stage area, surrounding it with torches and sacks that likely held flammable powders. He and Brienne scouted at night, inching close enough to overhear fragments of conversation. The cultists spoke of the waking of the blood and the bride of flame, terms that sent chills through Jon. They described Lady Melanie as their high scion, who would conduct the ceremony under the watchful stars. On the fourth night, Brienne and Jon crouched behind a collapsed column. Lightning flickered again. Storms were frequent here, drawn to the coast. Below them, the amphitheater glowed with 100 torches. Cloaked figures formed a circle, chanting in a language that might be High Valyrian, though much was garbled and archaic. Brienne's breath was shallow. "They're practicing," she whispered. "Rehearsing the rites?" Jon nodded grimly. He could see a robed figure in the center, arms raised. A tall woman with hair coiled in an elaborate style. Lady Melanie. Her voice rose and fell with incantations that made the hairs on Jon's neck stand upright. The circle moved in a slow dance, trailing glowing censers that wafted pungent smoke. A wave of dizziness swept over Jon, as if the smoke or chanting had some arcane pull. He gripped the stone, forcing himself to stay grounded. He recalled the stories of Valyrian sorcery, the blood mages who shaped dragons and bent them to their will. This cult evidently believed they could replicate that vile art. Brienne tugged his sleeve. "We have to go. If they spot us." He gave a tense nod. Quietly, they retreated into the labyrinth of ruins, returning to their makeshift shelter. Davos and Val met them anxiously, but the news was bleak. More cultists arrived each day, the ritual intensifying. The final ceremony was set for tomorrow night, the 6th day since they'd arrived. "The amphitheater is crawling with them," Jon said, removing his damp cloak. "There must be at least 40 or 50 by now, possibly more in the tents." Davos's face was drawn, pain and fever lines marking his features. "We can't face that many directly. Our best chance is sabotage." Val's eyes flicked to the courtyard. "We have the fire powder, the black oil, all near the egg. One spark at the right time could destroy everything." Brienne lowered her gaze. "But if we ignite it too early, they might move the egg or snuff the flames. We need to wait until the moment they set the pyre. Then the flames will spread quickly." Jon paced, running his hands through his hair. Yes, but that means infiltrating the amphitheater during the ceremony. One or two of us must slip in close enough. The rest provide distraction or cover. Val inhaled sharply. I'll go. I'm quick on my feet, and my wound is healing. If it's just me or one other. Jon shook his head. No, I'll do it. I have more experience with dragons. If something goes wrong, I might sense it. She opened her mouth to argue, but the severity in his eyes silenced her. Davos cleared his throat. You'll need a real distraction. Maybe we can set small fires in the tents, 'cause panic. Brienne agreed. Yes, if half the cultists scramble to save their supplies, you'll have a better chance to dash in and detonate the powder near the egg. But you won't have much time. Jon grimaced. I know. The key is to ensure no one is right next to the egg when it goes up. I don't relish killing them all. Val's expression hardened. They made their choice. They're trying to unleash something that could kill thousands. If some die in the attempt, that's war. Jon swallowed, remembering the weight of lives lost in King's Landing. Still, I won't slaughter them needlessly. But yes, we have no choice. We must act. They spent the rest of that night finalizing details. Davos would cause small fires among the tents, using lamp oil they'd scavenged from a deserted stable. Brienne would create a secondary distraction near the amphitheater's entrance, possibly by toppling a cart or attacking a guard. Val would provide cover for Jon if he needed to retreat, loosing arrows from a vantage point among the crumbling seats. Jon alone would rush to the stage, slip behind the circle of cultists, and ignite the black powder. The resulting conflagration, if timed right, would engulf the egg. With luck, the thick smoke and flame would sabotage the hatching entirely. If the egg still cracked, well, that was a chance Jon had to take. By dawn, they were as ready as they would ever be. Davos, still pale with fever, insisted on carrying out his role. He managed a weak smile. I might die tomorrow, but at least I'll do it fighting for the realm. Brienne clasped his hand, voice trembling with respect. We'll do our best to keep each other alive. Val bandaged her arm anew, tightening her tunic. She tested the tension of a borrowed shortbow they had scavenged from a fallen cultist's guard during a midnight recon. She could string it well enough. I'll be in position, she said to Jon, eyes steady. Just give the signal. Jon nodded, heart thrumming with anticipation and dread. Thank you, all of you. They spent the day in tense silence, resting for the night ahead. Ghost paced the courtyard, uneasy. Outside, the cult's preparations intensified. Carts rumbled, chanting rose occasionally, drums throbbed in the distance. As the sun sank, a lurid glow lit the amphitheater. Torches by the score illuminated the ancient stone, and the silhouette of a tall platform or altar took shape in the center. The final night had come. Under the cover of dusk, they moved into positions around the amphitheater. The wind carried the scent of incense and something more acrid, likely the black powder. From vantage points among the ruins, they observed the cultists gathering in a wide circle around the central stage. Lady Melanie stood at the focal point, robed in crimson, arms raised to the sky. Behind her, on a sturdy wooden platform, lay a large crate. That must be the egg, concealed or partially exposed. Jon's blood pounded. If it hatched, if the dragon emerged, everything might be lost. But if he could set the black powder alight, the egg might be consumed before it fully awakened. He prayed that the scalding memory of Daenerys's pyre would guide him in reversing that dread ritual. They parted ways. Davos, limping slightly, skirted the encampment of tents near the hillside. Brienne advanced toward the main entrance, staying low behind toppled columns, ready to cause havoc when the time was right. Val climbed the broken stands from the opposite side, shortbow in hand, each arrow fletched with scavenged quills. Jon waited behind a half-fallen arch, cloaked in shadow. Ghost crouched beside him, white fur barely visible in the gloom. Below, Lady Melanie began chanting, her voice carrying a strange resonance. The circle responded in unison, raising their arms. A drumbeat rumbled, Torches flared higher as cultists fed them some powder. Then came a swirl of dancers, acolytes in tattered silks, who spun around the central platform. Their keening song pricked Jon's skin with an otherworldly chill. He forced himself to focus. Through the flickering torchlight, he glimpsed sacks and crates stacked around the platform. If the black powder was there, one spark would suffice. But the circle of worshippers ringed the platform, and a half-dozen guards patrolled the outer edges, each armed with a spear or sword. Time crawled. The chant rose. Melanie lifted a gilded dagger toward the sky, its blade catching the firelight. She called out in a mixture of High Valyrian and the common tongue. Blood for flame, flame for life. Arise, child of Valyria. By our will, by our blood, by our fire, be reborn. Jon's heart thudded. This was it, the moment. He whispered to Ghost, "Stay. If I call, come for me." Ghost's ears flattened, uncertain, but Jon repeated the command. Then he slipped away, edging around the outer circle. The guards seemed captivated by the spectacle, though they paced with a measure of vigilance. Suddenly, a shout from the hillside camp. Flames burst among the tents. Davos had lit the fires. Panic rippled through the crowd as some acolytes broke from the circle, rushing to see what happened. Guards barked orders, uncertain whether to remain or help. Moments later, another outcry from near the amphitheater's main entrance. Brienne's diversion. Jon caught a glimpse of steel glinting in torchlight as she clashed with two guards. More cultists peeled away to deal with the intrusion. In the confusion, Jon darted forward, slipping through the swirling acrid smoke from the braziers. The circle was broken. Lady Melanie stood in the center, glaring at the disruptions, but resolute in her chanting. Several high-ranking scions remained, continuing the incantation around the platform. Jon spotted the crate, its lid removed, revealing the dragon's egg. His chest tightened. In the dancing firelight, the shell glowed with an ominous pattern of dark green and black, pulsing faintly as though alive. He crouched behind a cluster of sacks. The smell of the flammable mixture was overpowering. Quickly, he drew a small tinderbox from his belt. His hands shook. If he set a spark now, would he be caught in the explosion? He remembered the plan. He needed a brief fuse. He groped for a small scrap of cloth from his pocket, tearing a strip. Carefully, he soaked it in lamp oil from a canister he carried, then wedged it under the lip of a powder sack. A cultist's voice rang out from behind, dangerously close. Jon froze, listening to the footsteps pass. Sweat beaded on his brow. The chanting continued, a malevolent hum that seemed to vibrate in his bones. He steadied himself, struck flint against steel. Sparks danced. The cloth caught a small flame, sputtering. He had seconds to get away. He shoved the sack closer to the egg, hoping the chain reaction would engulf the crate. Lady Melanie's voice rose in triumph. "Fire and blood! Hear us, ancient lords!" Jon sprang up, sprinting away from the platform, weaving between stunned cultists who scarcely registered him in the swirling chaos. One lunged, but Jon twisted aside, knocking the man's staff away. He dove behind a low stone partition, heart racing. A muffled whump echoed through the amphitheater. Flames shot up from the platform, scattering sparks. A roar of alarm broke out among the scions. Some flung themselves backward. Others rushed forward, shrieking incantations to quell the blaze. Jon pressed himself flat. Fire lit the sky, reflecting off the amphitheater's ancient seats. A second explosion boomed, a chain reaction. The crates of powder and oil likely ignited in sequence. The platform erupted, sending splinters flying. Through the chaos, Lady Melanie's anguished scream cut the air. "No! Protect the egg!" Jon peered over the partition. Flames consumed the center of the stage, swirling in hungry tendrils. The egg glowed fiercely within the inferno, cracks forming along its shell. His heart stuttered. Was it hatching at the very moment it was immolating? Smoke churned, stinging his eyes. A shape lurched in the flames. A small, thrashing silhouette torn between life and destruction. A newly born dragon, if it was that, let out a keening wail that resonated with primal fury. For a breathless moment, Jon thought it might break free of the blaze, but then the swirling tongues of flame engulfed it entirely. The wail cut off abruptly. The ring of cultists fell into disarray. Some wailed in despair. Others tried to douse the fire with sand or cloaks. Lady Melanie stood near the edge of the stage, tears of rage carving through soot on her cheeks. Her green eyes burned with a hatred so intense it seemed to radiate into the night. "It can't end like this," she screamed, turning her face skyward. "Rise, child, rise." But the child of Valyria did not rise. The inferno consumed the shell, caving it in. A wave of searing heat blasted outward, forcing onlookers back. A hush followed, broken only by crackling flames and the moans of the wounded. Jon's chest tightened with both relief and horror. They had stopped the hatching, but the destruction was immense, and people lay injured or dying around the stage. The cost was high. He forced himself to move. He had to find Val, Brienne, and Davos and escape before the cult regrouped. Staying low, he crept around a jagged wall, ignoring the swirling smoke that stung his throat. He glimpsed shapes flitting through the stands, some fleeing, others searching for saboteurs. Then an arrow whistled overhead, striking a pursuing guard behind him. Jon whirled. Up in the seats, Val stood, bow in hand, wind tugging her hair. She waved frantically, urging Jon to hurry. He scrambled up the crumbling steps. Another guard tried to cut him off, brandishing a sword. Ghost suddenly appeared, barreling into the man with a snarl, knocking him down. The guard yelled, trying to fend off the direwolf. Jon slashed across the guard's back, ensuring he stayed down, then called Ghost away. Val offered a hand, pulling Jon into the upper stands. "We did it?" she gasped, eyes darting to the blaze. Jon nodded, chest heaving. "The egg, it's gone." She let out a shaky laugh, tears welling. "Thank the gods." A shout rose from the far side. Lady Melanie's voice, raw with fury. "Find them! Kill them! In the name of Valyria, kill them!" Cultists began swarming the stands, brandishing weapons. Others yelled for buckets of water, but the old timbers in the amphitheater stage were ablaze, fueling an inferno. Smoke billowed, choking the air. Val tugged Jon's arm. "We have to flee." "Where's Brienne?" "Davos." "I don't know. Let's circle around. Keep to the shadows." They darted along a broken ledge, Ghost at their heels. Flames illuminated the night behind them. Across the amphitheater, Jon spotted Brienne locked in combat with two robed fighters. She wielded her long sword in crisp arcs, driving them back. Then Davos emerged from behind a collapsed pillar, lobbing a clay jar that shattered at the cultists' feet, releasing a cloud of stinging powder. They staggered, eyes watering, letting Brienne strike them down. "Over there," Jon pointed. Val nodded. They made their way around the top row, scurrying behind fallen stone slabs. Occasionally, an arrow hissed past. Cultists on the far side were firing blindly in the chaos. Once they reached Brienne and Davos, the older man was breathing raggedly, leaning on his sword like a cane. Blood stained his bandage anew, and his face was pale as milk. Brienne's cheek was cut, her hair singed at the ends, but she stood tall, scanning for more threats. "You did it?" she panted. Jon nodded. "The egg burned. The hatchling, if it even formed, didn't survive." Relief flickered in her eyes. "Then let's go. They're rallying." They bolted up the stone steps, the acrid smoke swirling around them. The drums of the ceremony lay toppled, half-scorched. Cultists scattered or advanced in clusters. Lady Melanie's shrieks echoed from somewhere near the stage. "Bring me their heads!" From the stands near the exit, a group of guards tried to block their path. 6 men in black cloaks fanned out, weapons gleaming. Jon gripped Longclaw, fear and resolve warring within him. Val knocked an arrow, raising the bow. Brienne and Davos steadied themselves. But before the guards could charge, a flaming timber from the stage collapsed with a mighty crash, sending up a storm of sparks. The amphitheater's partial wall trembled, chunks of stone falling. One guard scrambled away just in time. Another was hit by a falling block, pinned with a bone-chilling scream. The rest darted for safety, giving Jon's group an opening. "Go!" Jon shouted. They sprinted through the swirling ash, leaping over rubble. A few cultists rushed them, but Jon, Brienne, and Val beat them back with sword and arrow. Davos, swaying on his feet, still managed to strike a desperate blow at one robed figure who tried to tackle him. At last, they reached the outer edge of the amphitheater and ducked into the labyrinth of ruined streets. Coughing on smoke, they half stumbled, half ran, leaning on one another. Ghost scouted ahead, his keen nose guiding them away from pockets of enemies. Despite the darkness, they navigated the broken lanes until the glow of the fire receded behind them, replaced by moonlight. Only then did they pause, collapsing against a toppled column to catch their breath. Jon's lungs burned. "Davos, let me see your wound." Davos shook his head, slumping to the ground. "It's fine, just need to rest." Brienne knelt beside him, checking his pulse. Her face tightened. "He's burning up. This can't wait." Val glanced around. "We need to get out of these ruins, find our horses, and leave before the cult reorganizes." Jon nodded, forcing himself upright. "We destroyed the egg, but Lady Melanie might have others. We can't stay. We must warn King Bran in person." A groan rumbled from Davos as Brienne helped him to his feet. He leaned heavily on her. "I'll manage," he muttered, voice weak. They limped through the shattered outskirts, ears alert for pursuit. Shouts and the roar of fire still echoed behind them, but it seemed the cult was too busy fighting the blaze or reeling from the sabotage to mount a coordinated chase. After a tense hour, they found their horses still hidden among the rocks. The animals whinnied anxiously at their smell of smoke and blood, but recognized their owners. Jon hoisted Davos onto the chestnut mare, strapping him in place. Brienne and Val mounted up, scanning the horizon. Ghost paced nervously. Jon took one last look at the distant amphitheater, its once proud silhouette now crowned with flame. He thought of the half-formed dragon, snuffed out before it could terrorize the realm. Relief mingled with sorrow. Another monstrous calamity, prevented at great cost. Yet a gnawing worry persisted. Lady Melanie had implied there were other eggs. She might regroup, fueled by rage and desperation. This was only one victory in a longer war, but it would have to suffice for now. He gripped the mare's reins. "We ride south, then east to the coast. Try to meet Captain Tarly if he's still there. If not, we'll find another ship or head to Westeros by land. Either way, we must deliver our warning." Brienne and Val nodded. Davos managed a weak salute. Ghost trotted alongside them as they set off under the pallid moon, leaving smoke and the wails of the scattered cult behind. They had done what they came to do, prevent the hatching, at least for tonight. As the battered party wound through the broken road, Jon felt the old weight of duty settle in his chest once more. He might never escape this cycle of conflict, but as long as there were threats to the realm, be they undead armies or new-forged dragons, he would stand against them. He recalled his father's words. The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. Jon had passed judgment on the Scion's ambition, choosing to extinguish the spark of a reborn Valyria before it became an inferno. In so doing, he and his allies had again plunged themselves into peril. But that, he supposed, was the price of protecting the living. They rode into the night, guided by faint starlight, hearts heavy yet resolved. The world was wide, and dark forces still stirred, but for now, at least, they had stayed the birth of one more dragon bent on conquest. And in that small victory, they found hope enough to keep going, riding onward beneath the silent sky, bearing the burden of a secret that would shake the Seven Kingdoms and all beyond if ever a new dragon took flight.